Hello everyone, welcome to another stream. Welcome on in. Astanex, Scowleezy, Boris Vainblatt, Ponyboy, Jube, Son of Dark, welcome all in. Hope you are all doing well. I'm doing pretty well myself. So yesterday we watched a couple videos by, man, I can't even keep track of what we just did yesterday. I'm pretty sure it was Mad Luigi, Jarhead, and Lore Hunter. Okay, yeah. So at the end of the Lore Hunters video, I was trying to remember some things relating to the Frenzied Flame stuff and Kale more specifically that was cut. And I couldn't find the content that I was looking for because Kale's lines aren't actually in the text dumps of the game because they're just kind of like voice files. I did have, or like I went through a lot of the voice files on my own like months back when I was trying to find Topes' cut content where he said like the Albinorks came from the Eternal Cities. So I heard some other stuff relating to Kale's quest, which is kind of like I think how I first learned about it. But I have found a video that does have those lines, so I wanted to show them off here to just kind of tie into what I was talking about at the end of the last stream and the possibility that Creary could have been a nomadic merchant in earlier drafts of the story and that they kind of are all one person, and that kind of ties into the Frenzied Flames goals of like getting rid of everything that distinguishes and divides. So before going into Ember's videos for tonight, I felt like showing this off because it's just kind of cool, and with this having only 11,000 views, I feel like not too many people are familiar with it. So this is a very quick video, about 5 minutes long.
Use this crystal ball.
So let's dive on in. And let me know how the volume is, as always. And sorry if you hear the dog digging in the background.
To find a stream mist. Go up to someone sleeping and use it. Any dream mist you collect is sure to fetch a fine price. Thank you for bringing us dream mist. You have our gratitude for collecting so much dream mist. This is a token of thanks. Please accept it. I have a lot of brothers. There are more and more of us. The 10-and-1 children will soon be the 101 children. At this rate, we'll be the 1,000. One of our brothers has been assailed.
So I don't exactly know what he means by the 10-and-1 children becoming 101 and then 1,000. Maybe it just means that the Frenzied Flame is spreading. That's speculative. But as we go forward, he'll kind of give us a little bit more info.
My brothers have been attacked. Our brothers have been attacked. You've wronged one of our brothers. This will not go unpunished. You can be sure of that.
So this kind of ties into what I was talking about, where Kale still has a couple of lines hinting at their unified nature, that all of the merchants are like kind of like work with each other and they're deeply unforgiving. So if you attacked one in previous iterations of the story, they may have all been meant to become hostile towards the player character. You think that language is used somewhere else with America's Demigods? What specifically?
I am not quite like the rest of my brothers. Then they might come again and lock me in that tomb. A deep, deep hole. Below those omen even. The curse.
So him saying that could imply that Kale was originally sent underground there. Obviously, I don't think that matches up with the retail build of the game, or even other forms of content where Kale is kind of ignorant of the Frenzied Flame prescription area with all the nomadic merchants. So this must be even like earlier cut content.
Flame burns inside our eyelids, making us smudge and blend together. Some brothers are sedentary. When one of us is angry, it makes me angry. Or was it I who was angry first?
And I just kind of love that kind of world building here. And I'm really sad that we didn't get anything quite like this. Yeah, and then I think next is where he might start to insinuate that Shibari is one of them, or maybe it's a little bit further on.
I am my brothers, and they are I. Our travels keep us separate. Before our anger blends and we forget who we are. Anger is burning away the lines between us. Sometimes I feel like I'm losing what makes me who I am. Even this blazing curse. Anger is burning away the lines between us, corroding the lines that separate us.
And I think this bit of dialogue right here is really important to help contextualize what the hell happens with Edgar and his path to become like a revenger and get his kind of vigilante justice for his daughter.
Anger diffuses amongst us, blurring the lines between us, burning bit by bit. Mustn't forget. Have to remember. I'm afraid I've decided to up sticks and move on. Just preparing for the journey now, in fact. Care to make any final purchases, old friend? The thought frightens me of staying in the same place for very long. A nuisance it may be, but I'm always moving about. Could I ask you to do something for us? One of our traveling brothers insists on jostling the cursed flame. Its fire spreads, creeping surely, imperceptibly.
All right, so this is the stuff that I think is supposed to be a veiled reference to Creary, but again, heavy speculation on supercut content at this point.
I'm not sure which of us it is. My brothers and I long await the day that the cursed flame dies out, and we can finally rest, and I can finally dream alone. The music, it just carried me away. I didn't even notice you. Our song derives from an old lullaby, sung for us long ago, deep inside our tomb. Its melody allowed us to sleep, despite the cursed flame. But whoever it was sings no longer. That's what the instrument is for. The timbre of its song calms the flame, however slightly, caressing, gently, so that we don't blend together.
So I also really enjoyed this stuff of relating the song to sleep, or song to a lullaby, and obviously a lullaby to sleep, and that helps kind of soothe them, because that helps give a bit more of a juxtaposition to like Miquella's involvement with the unalloyed gold needle and the frenzied flame, perhaps. The dog's distracting me. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so Miquella, and obviously Miquella's ties to Saint Trina and sleep just kind of go hand in hand as to why the unalloyed gold needle might be able to get rid of the fate of the Lord of the Frenzied Flame, perhaps. But of course, all that stuff is not really present in the retail, unfortunately.
Apologies, I'm just about at the end of my tether. Ah, there you are. Thought you could play us all for fools, did you? You are now a sworn enemy to one and all of us. You rotten thief! Burn, you wretched thief! You're the thief! I'll have your head, you piddling little thief. May the flames take you whole. Beware, my brothers. This tarnished is a menace.
To properly understand.
Use this crystal.
Yeah, so this video is super cool. I'm going to go ahead and link it into the chat. I don't have it in the video description yet or anything, but as you can see, this version of Kale is quite different from what we get in the game. It's also quite different from what I believe is in Sekiro Doobie's cut Kale questline video. But this is a really good video by Straytech, so go ahead and give them a like if you enjoyed going through this like I did. All right. So yeah, that just ties into what I was thinking about in relation to the Lore Hunters video yesterday. And obviously, with this stuff being supercut content, the Lore Hunters claims about the Frenzied Flame, I think, are still really solid and probably might be intended by the devs. But I do still wonder if Shabriri is meant to have ever had a connection to the nomadic merchant or was like previously a nomadic merchant. I have wondered whether or not Shabriri is telling the truth and that he is Chaos incarnate. And if that's true, if Chaos is supposed to be technically separate from the Frenzied Flame, and he could just be using the Frenzied Flame because he wants to see the world burn. But, you know, that's some hashtag deep lore that we don't really know too much about. So yeah. Scowlies says that Saint Trina could have some strong connection to music, especially the king used to put people to sleep. And Trina's the god of long YouTube videos you should listen to late at night. AKA my streams. Alright, Jan Jarvis, welcome back to the stream. Alright, so that was a very fun video for me to share with you guys. Now we have some other fun videos to go into, starting with Ember's best and worsts of the Soulsborne games, including Elden Ring. So the first one will be the best feature in every Souls game, including Elden Ring, by Ember. Let's go ahead and dive on in.
For years, we've had an ongoing debate about which Souls game is the best, but today I wanted to talk about the best aspect of each Souls game, from Demon's Souls all the way to Elden Ring. I'll include timestamps for each game so you can skip around if there's one you haven't played before. Starting with Demon's Souls, we have the atmosphere. I didn't play the original Demon's Souls, but the remake really seemed to capture what made the game so popular in the
Wow. He just said that straight up. Oh man, I'm sure all the fans were frothing in the comments about that. That is one hell of a hot take. Just because I know so many people really hate the Blue Point remaster in comparison to the actual atmospherics of the original. So, I mean, I'm not gonna like disagree with him. I haven't played the original either. I just think that's a very bold claim to make, especially if he hasn't played the original. He's definitely a bolder man than I am, this Ember guy is. You're at a Tosker crying somewhere right now? Ooh. Yeah, I figured these videos might be a little bit spicy, and that's kind of half the fun of looking at them. If he doesn't say Majula is better and you're getting the pitchforks.
first place. This was the last Souls game I played besides Elden Ring, and I was shocked at how well it held up in comparison to the rest of the games. It truly feels like it has its own identity. Seeing a huge castle at the beginning and making my way through Boletaria was a feeling I thought was no longer possible for a Souls veteran. While the medieval theme obviously continued throughout the series, the world itself feels very unique in comparison to the later entries. Demon's Souls is a much shorter game, but the vibe feels very consistent and makes sense all the way through. All the items and weapons fit with the world very well, and nothing feels super out of place. Obviously, there were some mechanics that weren't fully perfected yet, but the world building was nothing short of brilliant and allowed for an incredibly immersive experience. Moving on to Dark Souls, we have
in some ways, I agree with it, and I was also very pleasantly surprised by Demon's Souls. I mean, I kind of went into it expecting, like, Dark Souls 2.0 or something like that. But no, I actually enjoyed Demon's Souls more than I did Dark Souls 2, which was a very pleasant surprise for me. There's no hot take if you do no research. Then they're just all takes at that point.
Have the level design, obviously. I think everyone can agree that this was certainly the strong point of this game. The interconnectivity of the world in Dark Souls is incredible, and I genuinely remember my mouth hanging wide open when I'd find myself back in Firelink Shrine thinking I was miles away from it. The amount of shortcuts and secret paths in this game is unbelievable, and the fact that they made so many areas connect back to the main hub without you noticing is insanely impressive. Obviously, it falls apart after Anor Londo, but I think the first half of this game really showed what FromSoft was capable of in terms of level design. The way the world was designed allowed for total freedom of the player based on their skill level while still pulling them toward the intended direction, which is something totally unique in gaming. In the formula.
So I'm kind of a bit of a stick in the mud when it comes to Dark Souls 1's level design. Well, don't get me wrong, I do love like all of the individual areas and a lot of the quirks of these levels. It being interconnected, it just kind of feels a little bit overhyped to me. Like I enjoy it by all means. However, I wouldn't say that that's the best feature of the game to me. I really feel like Dark Souls 1's best feature was its world building overall. And obviously, the intro to the game really does a lot of heavy lifting to make it work so well as it does. So, yeah, that's just kind of my little bit of a hot take. I do enjoy Dark Souls 1, but I feel like the non-linearity of the game isn't really all that non-linear. I mean, there's a couple options you can go, but you're still kind of streamlined to ring the 2 bells at the beginning and then go to Anor Londo and then, like back down to either Seath or Nito or the Witch. So while the world is interconnected, it feels a little bit shallow to me in comparison to how so many people praise it, if that makes sense. Which game did I play first? I originally played Dark Souls 1, and then I played Bloodborne, and then I did Dark Souls 2, and then, put it down, then did Dark Souls 3, did Dark Souls 2, then Demon Souls, I think. I don't remember at that point. Oh, and I forgot, Sekiro in there somewhere. I think I definitely played through Sekiro completely before going back to Dark Souls 2. Astanex does think that the world design was the best. That elevator shortcut makes people cream their pants. You take that out and people wouldn't be talking about the level design nearly as rapidly. Yeah, I don't think you're wrong about that. Maybe it's because I played other games like Metroid Prime, where I think the world is also very interconnected. Maybe not quite at the same level, like a lot of the zones don't connect into each other. But, well, I do think Dark Souls 1 did it very well. It just wasn't, maybe it just didn't, I didn't find it to be, the most novel thing that I've ever experienced in a game. I don't know. Okay.
Flow is pretty simple. If you go to an area that's too hard, go somewhere else. You're probably not supposed to be there yet. The most popular example of this is the graveyard right in front of Firelink's shrine that encourages players to find another path by making sure they beat your ass. They send the message loud and clear. The lore along with the world ties together very well and allows for a very fresh experience and one I'll certainly never forget. Dark Souls 2, the experimentation. This game did so many things wrong and so many things right. It's strange to me that they didn't add back any of the things they did right until later. While 4 months ago,
So I'm not sure what he's going to talk about, but I can kind of see where he's coming from with this. Obviously, it's really easy to dunk on Dark Souls 2, and I'm definitely guilty of it because I'm a well-known Dark Souls 2 not enjoyer. But I think I would agree that if you put it under the label of experimentation, that's kind of its best feature, but the execution pretty much could have used refinement across the board. And I agree with his other claims here that I wish that they incorporated this stuff a bit more holistically into the other games. And so some of the things that come to mind about Dark Souls 2 specifically are the torch and the sconce system. I think that's pretty cool. It's a little bit annoying, but it's for the whole idea of Dark Souls being a battle of kind of light and darkness and fire and darkness, it makes a lot of sense to me on a thematic level. Some of the other stuff are obviously the Bonfire aesthetics and New Game Plus cycles. So power stancing, that also came from Dark Souls 2, which is another very good experimental feature that's no longer experimental. Hey Jay Dixon, welcome back to the stream. Symphony of the Night helps set the standard for 2D level design as far as Metroidvania goes. And Astanex said, Dark Souls 1 made people go wow because people were not as familiar with Metroidvania games back then. And I kind of agree with that. Metroid was nothing new, but you think Dark Souls 1 took it to 3D and did it really well. I'm pretty sure Metroid Prime still came out before that, but also, depending on how you look at games like Jak and Daxter or Spyro or even, Super Mario 64, there's certainly kind of a lot of parallels. I mean, Mario 64 is a lot more disjointed, sort of, because it's kind of got the hub world system going on, but the levels, the individual levels kind of had similar ideas going on in terms of where you explore. Maybe it's a little bit too apples to oranges, I don't know. If you're not lighting all the sconces, are you even playing the game? The game is playing you.
probably would have said power stancing as the best thing, Elden Ring ended up adding that back, so it felt kind of pointless to mention here. But I also really like the item and weapon variety as well as the lore of this game. Besides the other little things I'll mention in a second, the thing I personally loved in this game was the Bonfire aesthetic. This was an item that allowed you to reset any area, including the boss, and I'm really sad that no other game has this. I also want to mention the Pharaoh's Lockstones because even though Elden Ring added these in the form of stone sword keys, they don't quite work the same way. In Dark Souls,
So Ponyboy said, you think Prime was panned by reviewers at the time? That's not how I remember it. I remember Prime kind of being beloved by reviewers, but nobody really playing it. And I think part of the issue, like people didn't play it, is because it was on GameCube. The controls were a little bit clunky. I haven't played the remaster, so maybe I'll need to like give that a shot sometime, but I enjoyed it. In some ways, Metroid Prime does remind me a lot of Dark Souls in the way that most of its lore came through like atmospheric notes and like captain's logs, somewhat similarly to like Fallout 3 and 4 and like the Fallout series, if people are familiar with that. Dark Souls 3 took a lot of the good things Dark Souls 2 did and conveniently pretended they did it first. I mean, hey man, that's just capitalism, right? Zelda is kind of doing that in 3D, yeah. Yeah, I actually don't know when Demon Souls is PS3. Well, I guess that's kind of the GameCube era. I should like look at when some of those like more iconic games got released between like GameCube, like Wind Waker, Twilight Princess especially. But yeah, that's a good point with those 3D Zeldas too. That's a good point about Jack and Spyro. You haven't thought of that? Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2? Yeah. So I mean, I honestly, like, Dark Souls borrows a lot of elements from other games, but I think the thing that revolutionized it is, like, Dark Souls was the first one to kind of make pseudo-realistic action combat, where you are a, like, literal person that, like, rolls and interacts with enemies directly, rather than, like, super cartoonish jumping on enemies or turn-based battles or things like that. Like it's a lot easier to impress upon like the chosen undead and whatnot, like the player's own psyche. Like what if that was me? Could I be a knight like this? Can I fight these dragons? Sort of. I mean, obviously it's very unrealistic in many ways, but just like it is also kind of very realistic in other ways that a lot of the other games like Jak and Daxter weren't. All right, going back.
2, it felt like you never had enough keys to unlock every Pharaoh's Lockstone, so you had to pick and choose which ones intrigued you. You might get cool items or run into a hidden boss, and while the same is true for Elden Ring, they felt a little bit lazier. I felt like I always had enough keys in Elden Ring to open any fog wall I wanted, and the inside just never felt as cool or crazy as Dark Souls 2, aside from a few exceptions. They also had the fragrant branches of Yore that did a similar thing. There'd be a statue that you could bring back to life in order to get past it into a new area. What was most interesting about this item to me is that some of them even had bonfires behind them, which is a really cool addition. Getting a more convenient checkpoint is desperately needed in Dark Souls 2. Enemies also stop spawning after you kill them 15 times to prevent farming, but let's be honest, it's not super hard to grind levels in this game. I do think it's kind of nice though due to the enemies' aggro range, since it feels like they never stop chasing you. A lot of the time I found myself killing the enemies every time I went through an area on my first playthrough, and it was really nice when they were finally gone. There was so much experimentation, and while certain things like life gems probably won't make a return, I still think FromSoft's B team did a good job coming up with fresh ideas. Next, we have the...
Alright, so, yeah, going based off of what he just said there with, like, the fragrant branches of Yore and the Pharaoh's Lockstones, from the perspective of it being an experimentation type thing, I think, sure, those are cool ideas, but I'll refer back to what I said earlier, that it definitely could have used refinement. And one parallel that I like to make between Dark Souls 2 are like the Zelda games, where exploring kind of always feels a bit more rewarding, at least in the earlier iterations of the Zelda games, rather than like Tears of the Kingdom and maybe like Breath of the Wild to a lesser degree. But if you ever had like a wall that you knew you could like bomb, there's typically something behind it or like more incentive to do it. Whereas if you put one of your very limited Pharaoh's Lockstones into a doorway and it just spits out poison at you or just sets off a trap, it just kind of feels like a little bit of a slap in the face. And thinking on a more broader perspective of like why I think it kind of works a bit better in Zelda is that even though it does kind of cost resources, precious resources at that, to break open some of these things with like bombs, you can get more of them and eventually go back if you're really curious to kind of explore all of this stuff. Whereas you don't really ever get like a Pharaoh's Lockstone vendor towards the end of the game, which can justify how trolly some of the other traps and stuff are. Yeah, the run back to the bosses in 2 was kind of brutal. I think, well, the frigid outskirts with Lud and Zalid, that's just kind of a given to me, and I just kind of, try to suppress it from my memory, to be quite honest. So I always think of Elan first, just because I try to forget about Lud and Zalid. And part of the reason why Elan sticks out to me the most as having like the most brutal run back is because if there were iframes on opening doors and going through fog walls, you would be completely fine getting to that boss. But since there's not, you can get backstabbed in the animation and then have to deal with like however freaking many knights followed you because their aggro range is like limitless, as Ember was just saying. Getting a +2 silver serpent ring in the first area is a giant mistake. Dark Souls treats players like they're not morons. Yes, they can be challenging, but we trust you can figure it out. And I feel like Dark Souls 2 treats the player like they are a moron for like not knowing better at times, which puts it at odds with the other games in the series, to me personally. I know a lot of people love Dark Souls 2, but it just didn't scratch that itch for me. One of the Covenants rewards you with lockdowns? Oh, so yeah, that kind of only works a bit more if you're online, and I think that's a fair thing to point out to me, which I didn't really know about, but I played the games offline because my first time playing through Dark Souls 1, I was, well, what was the first time? So, okay, I should rephrase this. The first time I completed Dark Souls 1, it was after I was revisiting it and putting it down. Like, I got up to Ornstein and Smo and put it down for I don't know how long. And then the second time I went to play it, I was in the middle of the ocean, so I had no internet access at all. So I just kind of like played through it blind that way. And when I was playing through Dark Souls 2, I was going through the mindset of, I don't want to play this damn game twice. So I'm going to play in offline mode, so that way I have suitable lore footage without these stupid ghosts dancing around and making things look all wonky. But yeah, that's a very good thing to point out nonetheless. Understandable rage quit. Yeah, I got through the damn archers only to give up at Ornstein and Smo. But to be fair, like in my very first playthrough, I fell into the classic noob trap of diversifying my build. So I was just a little bit terrible at everything and good at nothing. So I learned and I got better. Just a little bit of a painful experience for sure.
Almighty Bloodborne, the game many people consider to be the greatest Souls game ever. There's so many things I could have picked for Bloodborne: the combat system, the Lovecraftian horror art style, the weapons, so many things in this game stand out. But the areas in this game are just unmatched. This is different from level design where the areas flow and connect perfectly. I'm talking about how enjoyable and aesthetically pleasing each area in this game is to progress. When I went back and played this game after completing all the others again, I noticed how little I would dread going through certain areas. When I replay something like Dark Souls 3, for example, I tend to dread the first few areas of the game, and that definitely takes away part of my excitement. Thinking about revisiting areas such as the Farron Keep or the Road of Sacrifices is enough for me to avoid playing the game again altogether, but Bloodborne is the opposite.
Damn, spoilers for his own review. No, but I think, yeah, trying to pick one thing about Bloodborne as like the best quote-unquote feature of it is super difficult. And I might go off on a bit of a different direction and say, for me, it might just be quote-unquote atmospherics, which is kind of like a vague statement. And so, obviously, like the thematics of the game kind of plays into atmospherics, but why I say atmospherics specifically is because I think Bloodborne's sound design is almost second to none. Like, being in this kind of Victorian setting with werewolves and stuff is all well and good, But the fact that you can just, if you play this game with headphones, which I highly, highly, highly recommend, if you like come into like the little bits of steam coming out of the ground, you can hear enemies like walking around, just how well you get kind of a 360 imaging of what's going on just by like what you're listening to, going along with everything surrounding that. So atmospherics might be a little bit of a too broad term for like a feature, but that's just, I feel like the one thing I can settle on as being like the best of this game, especially compared to the others. Like, just I feel like Bloodborne's thematics have probably the strongest presentation of all the other FromSoft games, and there's the caveat of if you're kind of into the Victorian setting. Like, I know a lot of people couldn't get into Bloodborne just because they weren't super interested into like the Gothic Victorian style things in it, which is perfectly understandable. The archers literally stopped you for 2 years in Dark Souls 1. Counterpoint, DS2 lets you have fast roll iframes while fat rolling. Well, if your iframes are all that low to begin with, they're all fast roll iframes. BB gives some really good weapons at the end of the game, which is super frustrating. Yeah, I think Bloodborne, I think that's just kind of an issue with all of their games, that some of the best items or the most fun items are only obtained at the end of the game. At least in the others, you can trade items, sort of, or have a friend drop them in, or all that, but Bloodborne doesn't have that, which is unfortunate, but I don't know. I wish they had like a new game minus option where you could start the game off by picking literally any of the items from like the messenger shop. So that way you could enjoy the feeling of actually upgrading your weapon rather than just only working with like a +9 or +10 weapon on a new game plus cycle. Yeah, and Bloodborne does have really good enemy variety, as Ponyboy says. The sound of walking on wooden planks is a chef's kiss. The crow barks, yeah. It's hilarious when you make the hunter cosplay as Abraham Lincoln. Alright, moving back to the vid.
Each area follows the classic From Software level design formula perfectly while still making it enjoyable to traverse. Places like Cathedral Ward have so many areas to explore, and the way each area is set up was executed very well. The level design is great on top of that and makes this game feel connected in a way that only the original Dark Souls could rival. Bloodborne was without a doubt the most excited I was to see what was coming next each time I finished a level, especially with the cosmic horror theme that came up later. Not to mention the DLC having a completely different feel to it while still maintaining the atmosphere that made this game great. It's so good that I probably would have played through this game dozens of times if it weren't for a couple issues I'll talk about in a later video.
Understandable. So yeah, I didn't even realize like FromSoft was the company that was making Bloodborne. I just remember seeing the trailers and being like, holy shit, that game looks awesome. And Bloodborne at that time was kind of competing with like what, The Order 1776, something like that, which I never heard anything of after it got released. It had some like pretty mid to subpar reviews. I think I heard that they were like remaking it, or it got remastered or something like that, or maybe it was just like released on Steam. Bloodborne. But yeah, after playing through Bloodborne, it really put like From Software on the map to me, because I didn't really associate From Software specifically with Dark Souls 1, just because I kind of treated it as a game that I'd heard good things about from like word of mouth. And so after I went through this and I was like, oh, they did the Dark Souls 1 as well. That this is what, you know, really cemented them in my mind as like a company to just like keep my eye on. And then of course, like Dark Souls 3 came out 1 year after Bloodborne to the date. So the funny thing is I bought Dark Souls 3 and I think I was going on deployment and I knew I couldn't really focus on it, so I didn't play it at all. And then after I got out, I went back through my game library and I was about to buy Dark Souls 3 from like the PS store, but it's like already in your library. I was like, wait, what? I didn't even remember buying it. So yeah, just kind of funny story about Dark Souls 3 for me. And no, I have not played the Life of P demo. I was thinking about it, but I don't know. I think I was focusing on other stuff and it just kind of like passed me by. You wish you didn't sell your PS4 to your best friend so he could play Bloodborne? Yeah. I'll have to check out Lies of P eventually. Not a fan of P? Okay. Oh, why not? Have you like played the demo, or is it just like a feeling, a vibe check, or highly recommend giving it a try? Isn't it supposed to come out soon-ish? I don't know. And then Lords of Fallen in October. The hits feel off? Okay, yeah. I think on the initial trailers, that's kind of how I felt. They looked really like there wasn't enough hits done or something. Like enemies just kind of ignored being hit to me. And so I was like, I'll wait to see like how people actually feel about it before I really dive in. But that was a long time ago that I saw those. Okay, let's see what he has to say about Dark Souls 3.
After Bloodborne, FromSoft released Dark Souls 3. To me, this one is a no-brainer, the boss fights. This was the first Souls game I played, and I found myself disappointed by the bosses when I went back to play the previous entries because they set the bar so damn high. I remember taking a video to send to my friend when I finally beat the Abyss Watchers with my hands shaking like crazy, only to see that there was another phase. There's only a few bosses in this game I would consider to be meh, and most of these would be considered great bosses in any other series.
Yeah, I think I kind of have to hard agree with Ember here. I feel like Bloodborne does hold its own for the most part against Dark Souls 3, but there's a little bit of a caveat to that, whereas like the base bosses of Bloodborne are pretty okay. There's not very many that are like fantastic. I think like Gascoigne is really, really good for like when you fight him. Cleric Beast serves its purpose very well, and it's a good boss in that regard. Amelia is a good boss. Bloodstarved Beast is decent, but it's a little bit too easily cheesed. And then, like, Gehrman, I think, is the other really big standout boss. And, like, we could hate Rom. Abritus has some issues with, like, her hitboxes and her charge. She's kind of annoying to fight. But Dark Souls 3, I feel like, is a lot more consistent up until you compare, like, Bloodborne's DLC to this stuff, which kind of isn't fair because Dark Souls 3 DLC bosses are just as good as Bloodborne's, if not arguably better, but that's just kind of like personal preference. So yeah, the bosses for 3 are really, really good. I totally understand where he's coming from with that Abyss Watchers fight. It's probably my favorite fight in the base game, even though it is like kind of on the easier side, all things considered. Or at least like once you know what you're doing, you can kind of curb stomp them, which is a little bit unfortunate. No, it's not that I had no love for the host of the nightmare. I was saving him for the end because he's like the end boss. Yeah, Bloodborne is such a different experience, it's hard to compare accurately. To be fair, I feel like the speed of Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne are comparable, with Bloodborne being slightly faster just because of like the rally mechanic, but yeah.
To mention the absolute masterpiece of boss design in the DLC, Freed, Gale, Madir, Twin Princes, these 4 alone are some of the best and most challenging fights.
I feel better because I often call the Demon Princes the Twin Princes or the Twinces by accident, so it's not just me.
In the series. In the main game, we have Pontiff, Abyss Watchers, Dancer, Twin Princes, Nameless King, Soul of Cinder, all just incredible fights that are balanced extremely well with your character level and the lore. This game mastered the balance between difficult and fun, making even the most challenging bosses enjoyable to fight over and over. Moving on, we have the
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel, although I do respect people who feel like by the time of Dark Souls 3, it really made perhaps an unwelcome adjustment to the previous formula of the other Dark Souls games by becoming more quick and more reaction dependent rather than a little bit more methodical, like was in the case of Dark Souls 1 especially, and Dark Souls 2 and even Demon Souls, which had like more gimmicks throughout its fights.
Only game that I think could rival the boss fights in Dark Souls 3, Sekiro. But I think there's one thing they did better. The combat, of course. While I was tempted to give this crown to Bloodborne due to the fast-paced gameplay along with the rally system, I think Sekiro objectively should take this spot. Not only is it the most satisfying combat system in my opinion, it also has tons of different tactics you can use outside of your sword. While I would have loved opportunities for different weapons to use, learning new skills such as the Creary counter and the Ashina cross, as well as using the different prosthetic tools at your disposal, really added some depth to the gameplay. A lot of people don't like the game as much due to the lack of build variety, but I think they provide more than enough tools to combat this issue, no pun intended. Sure, you
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. Like, in some senses, I do kind of agree that Sekiro does have the best combat, but on the other hand, I don't know, just because, like, it can be very satisfying, but Sekiro is a game that makes the player master all of its basic systems a bit too much. And so once you understand how to properly do combat and abuse it, the game becomes a lot less interactive. And I don't know. Don't get me wrong, it's still very fun. And it does have like a really good ebb and flow. I think for me, maybe Sekiro's best features are how cinematic the game is, which is kind of extremely hard to do and talk about properly without like a bunch of footage to go along with it. But Sekiro is like one of the best games I've ever played HUDless. But yeah, the combat is really good. I'm trying to think. Okay, yeah. So like, I think some of my issues with Sekiro's combat is just how much is gated beyond like the skill system, and it becomes a little bit annoying trying to relearn what skills you don't have if you go back to like a completely fresh playthrough, which is, you know, pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. So I guess that isn't really so much of a combat thing as much as it is like a combat system thing. So yeah, like Sekiro is a great game that's really held back by a lot of its systems, I think. But I think the most critical part of Sekiro is just, okay, I think I could go at it from this angle. I would enjoy Sekiro more if there was less emphasis on parrying, and not because I have like issues with parrying, because I don't. It's that for people who don't have like a properly calibrated TV or anything like that, you're gonna have a really hard time playing Sekiro. Or you're just going to keep spamming L1, and it just kind of takes away like the intention I think should be behind parrying, which is unfortunate. But why I kind of dislike parrying as such a central mechanic of the games is that I wish there were more ways to subdue the enemies beyond just like the posture stuff. I wish there was more emphasis on being able to kill enemies through HP damage specifically, or other things, whether they be like shinobi tools and like poisoning enemies or things like that. So Sekiro's combat feels too linear for me to appreciate it as much as I do think it deserves to be appreciated, if that makes sense. I don't know. It's kind of hard for me to properly articulate how I feel about Sekiro, because it's really good. It just could have been better. And I feel like the type of person that I am, I tend to focus more on the potential of things than like the reality of them, if that makes sense. The worst part of DS3 besides Poise, Poise, is people saying the Ashen one is stronger than the Chosen Undead. Ponyboy should play Sekiro. It's a really good game. It's really fun, for sure. Just make sure your TV is properly calibrated. You can't wait to see a hitless Sekiro run? Nah, I'm not super into like the challenge runs in general. Like, I could do it. It's just that level of sustained precision just kind of doesn't fascinate me, I guess. I don't know. It's hard for me to like pay attention and perform it mechanically precisely for that long, I suppose. Scaleezy says, Sekiro's difficulty curve is a lot steeper, which can make it a lot more frustrating learning new bosses. Oh yeah, and that's another good thing to mention. Like, I always played through the Dark Souls born games. No, not summoning, doing like no co-op whatsoever. So Sekiro wasn't a massive jump in difficulty for me. Whereas like a lot of people, like, gaming journalists probably relied on being able to overlevel enemies and summon for them in the previous titles. So a lot of people really hit the wall of Soulsborne difficulty in the most difficult Soulsborne or FromSoft game, I should say. So they were kind of in for a bit of a rude awakening, perhaps. Hey Revenant, welcome back to the stream. You feel like Souls games are better at giving you the illusion of combat, variety, and versatility compared to Sekiro? Yeah, and I think that's a good way to say that, the illusion of variety. And that's kind of how I feel about Dark Souls 1, which I didn't articulate super well earlier in terms of its level design. Like, it's non-linear, but it's kind of an illusion of choice because they, like, all branches of the road come down to a singular endpoint of like Anor Londo, essentially. So you can just kind of choose the order that you go, but it doesn't actually like change anything else about the other branches, if that makes sense.
You can't use a giant slow weapon that does massive damage, but that takes away from the whole point of the gameplay. It's give and take. The flow of combat in this game is balanced perfectly. Even when you're defending, you're still on offense. You can still R1 spam through a few of the basic enemies, but for the most part, that ability is gone. What I think makes the combat in this game so good is instead of dodging and waiting for an enemy to finish their attacks, you're an active participant the whole way through. When they're attacking, you're deflecting. Then you're attacking. Then you're using the umbrella to counter and get a free hit. Then you're deflecting. You're constantly taking actions rather than just rolling away, and I think that's what makes the combat so satisfying when you get that death blow. Coming in last.
So yeah, in some ways I agree with him, and he is technically right about like the R1 spam not being there quite to the same degree. However, after you become a lot more comfortable with Sekiro and understand like the unexplained mechanics of it, it becomes a lot easier to exploit them. So when you're attacking an enemy, if you're hitting their body, you can hear like the body hit sounds. But when the enemy starts deflecting your attacks, so you can hit their body, they deflect once, deflect twice, and then you know they're going to come up with like a counterattack. So you stop spamming R1, then you spam L1, and then repeat the process until they're done with their like attack patterns, and then you go back to your R1s. So that's kind of like the hidden part of Sekiro that isn't like explained super directly. Anyway. You think you don't like Sekiro as much because you can't do a strength build? Poor Wolf. He's only got the one arm, man. How's he gonna two-hand? Yeah, of course he can't do a strength build. Lower health makes poise recover slower, which adds a surprising amount that Sekiro players don't know. Which a surprising amount of Sekiro players don't know. Wow, I can't talk or read apparently. Honestly, I'm gonna blame the hearts thing over here, which is annoying the crap out of me. Yeah, and I do think that Sekiro could have been improved if the poise mechanic was explained a bit better, because it was very, very unintuitive to me that poise recovered as quickly as it did. And I think like it took me a long time to really get the idea that you need to kind of press the attack Bloodborne style. And once I figured out like the kind of ebb and flow of combat, it became easier. But I'm pretty sure the first time I fought the Guardian Ape, I killed its first phase out of HP rather than posture because I didn't understand the ape's attacks at that point. And once you become comfortable with Sekiro, you pretty much will never ever come close to killing a non-trash mob with HP damage. You'll just be relying on breaking poise and getting death blows.
Last but certainly not least, we have the masterpiece that is Elden Ring. This game is interesting because they do a lot very well, and it's obviously very different being an open world game. I think what Elden Ring does best is convenience, and this has a few meanings. This game doesn't waste your time and continues giving you the freedom and satisfaction to fight and explore without making you go a certain way or run 5 miles back to a boss fight. You can also level up at bonfires, travel back to any site of grace from anywhere in the open world, and customize your Ashes of War while resting. Obviously, the exploration is another thing they do incredibly well, which I think ties into this, and the only reason exploration wasn't my main choice is because the rewards you get didn't seem worth it very often. But Elden Ring is by far the best game to just hop in and enjoy yourself without worrying about ruining your entire playthrough by accidentally hitting the Firekeeper. It was from
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, speaking on convenience, I kind of understand where he's coming from, but I almost feel like Ember hasn't tried like a full-on consumable run or something like that. So, in general, I would agree that Elden Ring is a lot more convenient. However, it still has some of those artifacts of previous titles that are just like, why? So, for instance, there's a limited amount of times you can respec in like per new game cycle, which is extremely frustrating, especially if people are like super into PvP. There's also like the limited amount of max upgrade materials for weapons, which, you know, typical FromSoft stuff. And actually, does the last bell bearing? I'm pretty sure you can't get the final tier. Anyway, I might be wrong about that one. So I think my answer for like the best feature of Elden Ring, and this is kind of, I can't really even call it a feature, is that it might be like the amount of freedom it gives the player, which I mean does kind of tie into what Ember's talking about with like things being a lot more convenient, but it seems a hell of a lot more forgiving and more enabling of the player to explore with the inclusion of things like spirit ashes, which, you know, you can make the argument of convenience and stuff. And maybe convenience is a really good answer just because of like things like what are they called? The Stakes of America, allowing you to like respawn next to boss areas and stuff like that. You really wish there was a perfumer starting class? That'd be kind of cool too, yeah. Oh yeah, because if you had like the bottles on you too, that could have been really cool too, yeah. Uh-oh.
From Software's attempt at making a noob-friendly Souls game, and I think with that came a lot of convenience that even Souls vets can appreciate. Torrent is another example of this, which is not only super fun for fighting enemies and bosses, but also just makes the experience much better. If Elden Ring was made 5 years ago, I just know they would have made us run everywhere on foot and we still would have loved it. There are plenty of other aspects that Elden Ring does incredibly well, but after playing all the other games through again, its convenience is what stood out the most for me. With how incredible the for years we've had a
Yeah, I might end up agreeing that convenience might be the best feature of Elden Ring. Like, obviously it could be better, but that doesn't mean that it's not currently the best, I guess. So yeah, that was a really good video by Ember. I enjoyed the hot takes. I feel bad for the fans of the original Demon Souls. So if you want to give him hell, go ahead and leave him a comment about that. If you want to like the video, go ahead and check out the link in the chat and do all that. Oh, I'm not subscribed to him? Thought I was. Then he's probably not in my like contact list for the roundtable hold, so I'll probably need to fix that later. So, okay. Now that we've heard the best features of all of these Souls games, including Elden Ring, let's go into the worst features of them. The game is too big. Maybe that's the worst feature.
How incredible the Souls series is, each game is bound to have its flaws. Last time we talked about the best things from each Souls game, but today I want to look at the worst features from Demon Souls all the way to Elden Ring. And once again, there's timestamps for each game if you need them. Starting with Demon Souls, we have the boss fights. Understand that my first Souls game was Dark Souls 3, where I absolutely fell in love with the boss fights before playing the rest of the games in the series. The bosses in Demon Souls were pretty underwhelming for me after experiencing the incredible boss quality from games like Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro. I still think they were pretty enjoyable overall. Most of them just felt like gimmick fights instead of real combat, which I'm personally not a huge fan of.
So yeah, that's super understandable, especially with DS3 being like the very first reference point. I would disagree that like the bosses are the worst part of Demon Souls, although I mean there's kind of a lot of validity to it. And that I would say it's item economy and or like the world tendency is like the worst part because oh man, influencing world tendency and character tendency is really fun. That stuff is not explained very well and it directly guides how you can obtain certain items and certain upgrade materials for maxing out your weapons, which is just very unforgiving, especially if you don't have an internet connection.
Obviously, it gets some slack for being the first installment of the Souls series, and it does still have some great boss fights such as Flame Lurker and King Allant, but it's hard for me to ignore the fact that the bosses just feel like the weakest part of this game. I consider bosses such as the Storm King to be really great aesthetically, but I don't get as much enjoyment from the actual fight itself. Even the higher quality bosses just felt too easy for me compared to the rest of the series. I also think the world tendency system is obviously worth mentioning since it can be pretty unforgiving to newer players combined with its lack of explanation, but I like that they added some variety with quests and NPC battles in different world tendencies. Punishing you for
Yeah, and that's kind of a cool back and forth about world tendency. So, while DS1 kind of has like the illusion of choice, your choices kind of do matter more in Demon Souls, although a lot of those choices end up being a bit more unintentional, which is kind of like the shortcoming of Demon Souls, I think.
dying is a pretty classic From Software move, but it still feels like a slap in the face for a game that encourages death as a learning mechanic. Obviously, you can jump off the ledge in the Nexus after you beat a boss to avoid dealing with this, but what new player is realistically gonna think to do that? Moving on to Dark Souls,
Agreed.
we have the unfinished areas, aka basically the second half of the entire game. I could talk about the clunky gameplay due to no omnidirectional rolling, meaning you can only roll in 4 directions, but that's a problem you can get used to. What I can't get used to is how weak the areas after Anor Londo are compared to the first half of this game. I don't think many people will disagree here, and I really don't think the whole second half is bad. It's just very clear it was rushed and doesn't have the same magical interconnectivity that the first half did. Ending such an incredible first half with Anor Londo and Ornstein and Smo as the boss, it was pretty disappointing getting Lost Izalith with the Bed of Chaos to follow it up. I'm pretty sure Miyazaki even apologized for that one. But like I said, some of the areas and bosses were still decent, but we also got areas such as the Tomb of Giants. I know there's a quest you can do to get the Sunlight Maggot helmet for this area, but it honestly doesn't make it too much better. I will say they have some pretty fun bosses like Gravelord Nito and Gwyn, so maybe I'll just consider the weakness to be the level design in the second half. On the bright
Yeah, I don't really know how I feel about that because although Tomb of the Giants is a real pain in the ass, and I didn't go through it my first time with the Sunlight Maggot or like the Skull Lantern, I still enjoyed it partially because of how oppressive it actually was, and it's very different from every other area in that game. The deaths in Tomb of the Fallen Giants are just kind of hilarious to me, even though I totally understand why so many other people would get frustrated by that area specifically. I feel like Seath's area itself was actually, pretty decent. His boss fight is a little bit underwhelming though. A Bed of Chaos, even though like Lost Izalith kind of sucks a lot, especially with like all the lava there, obviously, and the dragon butts just walking around. I really enjoyed the atmospherics of the more like Javanese style chaotic buildings, which Miyazaki was proud of, but I feel like people would have been able to forgive those areas a bit more if they actually scaled with the player's level a bit better, or were a bit more difficult, or had something tying them in a bit more strongly. Even though the Bed of Chaos can be a real pain in the ass, I've never really hated it, just because I recognize that it's a gimmick boss fight, and I kind of like it for being different, although the execution definitely could have used a lot of work with the whole collapsing floor mechanic. At least FromSoft was kind enough to make sure that if you broke one of the seals on like her daughters or whatever, like on the sides, that they would stay dead for the next time you went into that fight, which was kind of really surprising, to be honest. And then, well, I actually liked Tomb of the Fallen Giants. I didn't really care for like the Nito boss fight. So if Nito's boss fight was better, if Seath's boss fight was better, and the areas were kind of like appropriately difficult and scaled a bit more with like how your character developed, it could be better. However, I would say that New Londo can be especially annoying if you don't have anything to deal with like the cursed enemies. So there is certainly like a lot of agreement in terms of them feeling a lot more lackluster in comparison to what came before, perhaps. But I feel like people kind of forgive New Londo because of its thematics. But yeah, I guess it doesn't live up to like previous level designs. But I mean, a lot of people hate Blighttown, but they don't seem to hate it as much as the other areas. I don't know. I don't think like the latter half of the game is as bad or is like substantially worse than some of the other things that came before. I think people just really, really enjoyed Firelink Shrine and the Undead Burg the most. And you kind of keep revisiting that area so people just kind of get more attached to it naturally over time. I don't know. So with that being said, what would I say the worst feature of Dark Souls 1 is? I think it kind of goes back into the issues that were still present in Demon Souls and not being able to respec or understand like what a lot of the stats are and like how they work together. Or maybe, okay, I think part of it just comes down back to like the item economy. And this is probably going to be my answer for most of these damn games. It's like, if you're dying, you're not upgrading your weapons, which keeps you alive. If you're upgrading your weapons, you better hope you're upgrading the right weapon to keep progressing your weapon, because if you do a variety, you're screwing up. You're screwing yourself over in the future if you don't have access to more of those upgrade materials. Because if you don't have a strong weapon, you're not going to kill enemies. And if you're not killing enemies, you're going to die. So you're not going to have souls to buy upgrade equipment for a strong enemy, or just for a strong weapon to kill enemies. And if you're not killing enemies, I mean, it just kind of becomes a bit of a circular problem for low-level players. And that's just kind of in common even with like Demon Souls. But at least the combat in Demon Souls is a lot slower. You had a hell of a lot more healing to kind of mitigate that. But I don't know. Tomb of the Giants is a great area. Okay, I'm not the only one. The loss of the eyesight from the lava glow. Scalazy says the DLC areas feel kind of weak. Not really any good items or enemies added to the game. The bosses are obviously great, but outside of that, it's kind of meh. Yeah, I kind of feel like that too, to be honest. Yeah, now that I think about it, like Darkroot Basin is also part of the main game. It has some interesting stuff, but I didn't ever like it as much as Tomb of the Fallen Giants, to be honest, or even Lost Izalith. It's just kind of one of those areas that's really big and there to me. So, yeah, I don't know. Those ghosts make New Londo for you? Yeah. And that's a good point as well. Like, New Londo is just different. It's a different kind of pain in the ass, which is kind of a good thing, if that makes sense. Jube honestly loves Blighttown. You think that might be a hot take, but it's a really well-designed area. So when we say Blighttown, do you mean the lower portion or the upper portion when you're trying to come down from the sewers? Because I kind of combine both of them in my mind. I'm not as big of a fan of the swamp area, but it's kind of cool for being different and super annoying. I guess I'm kind of a masochist because none of the swamps really ever bothered me in these FromSoft games. The only swamp area that actually annoyed me was in Demon Souls with the 3 or 4 like ogre dudes next to like a bunch of trash items. There's like 3 corpses, so you're like, oh man, there must be something good over there. And you can't roll away from them or anything like that. And they can like pretty much 2-shot the player, or if you get hit once, it's really difficult to recover. So that's like the only swamp area that I actually like really disdained in a FromSoft game that I played that I can think of off the top of my head. The upper Shantytown area, the swamp does kind of suck, yeah. You can't agree with me more, almost anxiety inducing? Okay. Sweet. So yeah, obviously Sif is cool, but I feel like Sif, in my mind, and this is kind of a stupid statement, in my mind, the area with Sif and the Grave of Artorias isn't exactly part of the rest of the Deeproot Basin or Darkroot Garden, whatever you want to call it. So the one spot of that I do kind of like is the spot with the Hydra. Just because I like Hydras, and it does lead to Dusk, which is kind of interesting. But a lot of the other stuff is just kind of like bland to me. The Gank Squad is kind of cool, but it's also kind of annoying. Like, not that area specifically. I just kind of had bad memories of being invaded there the first time I was playing, and I had no idea what the hell was going on. So not only was I getting killed by these NPCs that are like humanoids, I got killed by player characters who were just like super sweats. And I'm like level 41 with 12 stat points divested between a bunch of random crap. Yeah, the Gank Squad is a good farming spot though. The punch mushrooms. Yeah. So like the punch mushrooms are cool, but Deeproot or Darkroot Gardens just kind of feel a bit too sparse for me. Like there's nothing super interesting there because in my mind like the Sif stuff feels separate, which is weird because it's not, but it just has a different feel to me. And also, I don't like fighting a big dog and making it limp. It makes me feel bad. So even more reason to hate going down there, right? Ash Lake is your favorite place? Yeah, Ash Lake is one of the weird ones because even though I kind of hate really large open areas, I've come to realize kind of recently, honestly, Ash Lake just has that vibe check. The super deep chorus chanting, just immaculate. If Sif feels separate, understandable. Yeah, I think it's probably because like, never mind. Because of like the big gate, it just kind of feels like it's supposed to be a different area. It doesn't have the same vibe as Deeproot because it's a little bit brighter, maybe. Modders need to get on that Save the Pupper mod.
Side, the DLC revived this issue and kept me from going hollow, but it still doesn't justify the ceaseless discharge. Anyway, moving on to one that's a bit more juicy.
So I actually like Ceaseless Discharge because it's a different gimmick fight. I'm trying to think if I actually hate gimmick fights, or any gimmick fight rather. I mean, I would kind of consider the Moonlight Butterfly a gimmick fight, which is really annoying, and one that I hate just because it's needlessly slow, but I'll have to think about that a bit more.
Juicy, we have Dark Souls 2. While I'm tempted to say the worst part of this game is the adaptability stat, I have to say that it's the boss runs. They're awful. A lot of people have complaints about enemy placement in this game or how tons of them randomly get thrown at you in groups, but the worst part is that they do this on your way to the bosses as well. The run to the blue smelter demon in the DLC was without a doubt the most ridiculous and unfun experience in the entire series. You have to run through an area that makes you slower while you get shot at by archers, accompanied by as many basic enemies as they could possibly throw at you. And the worst part is, it's all for a reskin boss with delayed moves to throw you off, and it's something you paid for. I get that.
That's kind of a funny way of saying it for sure. So yeah, if you want to compare vanilla to Scholar, there's going to be a lot of differences. So I'm assuming he's talking about Scholar because he's talking about the DLC here. So the worst feature of Dark Souls 2 to me, I mean, the enemy runs can be annoying, but you might be able to argue that they could have been entirely mitigated if they gave you... Okay, so I'm going to maybe go a bit of a different direction. Man, there's just a lot that I kind of hate about Dark Souls 2 to just like say one thing. But based off of like what Ember is saying, like one thing that comes to mind specifically in relation to this is that there are no iframes on opening doors, on opening chests, and getting like backstabs or criticals on enemies, which on one hand, I appreciate that they had the balls to say, no, it's more realistic that you'd get hurt if somebody freaking swings a sword at you while you're doing some other random crap and not paying attention to your surroundings. But it's also just kind of really frustrating at how slow the Dark Souls 2 animations are in general. So, okay, yeah, I think the feature, if you could call it a feature that I hate the most in Dark Souls 2 is just like the overall speed and floatiness of the game. And this is something that I say quite often, and I apologize if I ruined Dark Souls 2 for you, like I inadvertently did for Sinister Stromboli by pointing this out. But when I play Dark Souls 2, it feels like I'm playing Dark Souls 1, but my character is running in water the entire time. Just because it's so slow, it feels like whenever you're moving, you're not really getting anywhere that you like in the time frame that you think you would. When you roll, it just feels super delayed, and like you go really far, kind of, but it's ineffective. So it's like you're effectively have like more mobility, but less agility, if that makes sense, or like more range. But hopefully that makes sense. I don't know, and animation times kind of tie into that. And so chugging in the Estus flask is freaking horrible, especially if you're more accustomed to the other games. I hate that the Estus stuff isn't instantaneous like in the previous games. And even if it wasn't instantaneous, it just refills so slowly. I do have a video on my channel on the main section where I compared the Estus recovery times of Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3. And Dark Souls 2 literally takes 3 times as long to heal completely what you would in Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3. So there were times where I felt like I was chugging with enough speed that a boss wouldn't kill me in the previous titles, but they would kill me in Dark Souls 2 because my health was still recovering very slowly. And of course, the chugging animations are very slow. Adaptability kind of plays into that stuff as well, but yeah, adaptability is its own beast, and as I found out when I leveled up a caster, adaptability, aka agility, is kind of a lot of a lesser issue because when you're a caster, you don't want to be close to anything to begin with, so you're rolling less, and your attunement levels up your agility as well. So casters just have it ridiculously made for Dark Souls 2 because you can stop gank squads before they come after you. You can snipe at a distance if you know how to use the binoculars. It's just kind of broken and made a deeply unfun game for me as a melee build bearable. Just to speak as harshly as I possibly can about this game, right? Don't forget the wonky ladder mechanics if you're trying to climb on with an enemy nearby. Not until Iron Keep to get the full Ember to unlock the Smith. Dead zones, oh yeah, and the stick for the 8 directional movement. I don't think the dead zones annoyed me that much, just because like everything else, like that was like such a lesser complaint to me compared to everything else with the movement. And also, welcome back to the stream, hey you. You've been watching Ratatosker stream it, and the voice lines from Vendrick and Aldia are so good. Yeah, the voice acting for all of their games is just really good. I think Pate might be like the worst part of Dark Souls 2 as far as I can remember, but he's not really patches anyway, right? Adaptability does speed some things up, but I mean attunement and agility is the real stat that governs it. No DS2 Lord Thunsu. No. Hey, you says, are you talking about the actual chug or the recovery? You don't mind the recovery being slower, but the chug can be a detriment. So the chug isn't actually that different from the other games. It might be like a couple frames slower, which isn't that big a deal, but for me, it's actually the recovery itself, because I can handle the life gems being slow. It's just I got so used to the Estus speed of Dark Souls 1 and 3 that 2 just feels kind of horrible in comparison to me.
They wanted to push the boundaries of difficulty a bit in this game, but this was just not the way to do it. Sir alone has an infamous boss run too, with tons of enemies chasing you and shooting fireballs at you the whole way through. It's almost impossible to make it to the boss without taking any damage. It got to the point where I was shaking every time I was close to beating a boss, but not from the thrill of finally being close to winning. It was out of fear that I might have to run all the way back again. Even if you do manage to run past all the enemies and beat the boss, they never de-aggro, so as soon as the fog wall disappears when the boss is dead, they all rush in at once and continue chasing you. I don't know if this was as big of a problem for anyone else, but this was without a doubt the most frustrating part of this game for me and makes me not want to play through certain parts again. The only reason I didn't say adaptability is because in my first playthrough, I didn't even know I was supposed to level it, and while it was a pain in the ass, I got used to it. A little bonus for this section is the frigid outskirts. That's really all I have to say. If you've played the DLC, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised he chose the other one with the blue smelter demon first, because maybe he's like me and he just literally tries to block it from his memory. So he just thinks of the other terrible areas first. So like I said on his last video, the run up to Sir Alan to me is kind of like my worst memory. Honestly, when I do consider the other area with the blue smelter demon, which I forget the name of, yeah, that can, I don't know, man, they both really suck. So for anybody who isn't familiar with Dark Souls 2, and I heard this before I played, but I didn't think about it until after, the each DLC has a quote-unquote like cooperator area, so you're not exactly meant to go through them individually. So the frigid outskirts, the area up to, wait, I don't think Alan actually counts for that, does it? Maybe it should. What else would count for that in that area? Maybe it's the lawn area, maybe it's not. But then, no, because it'd be the smelter one. The smelter's part of that. No, that's Shulva. So yeah, the area with the blue smelter demon, I think the area with Alan, and then frigid outskirts here in like Ilium Lois are all the designated co-op areas. And the way that it worked was people who didn't have the DLC could still be summoned here to help people with the DLC, and probably as like a marketing way to entice them to buy the DLC. And yeah. Eric Williams, welcome back. You still have to play DS2? Good luck. I guess that's all I can see. And Spaghetti, I don't remember if I welcomed you back to the stream. You tend to power game pretty hard, so DS2 feels less painful for you, but you get why people don't like it. And that's kind of always the harder thing to deal with on a first playthrough versus like once you know what to expect, the games become a lot easier just in general. You think you got through SOTFF without doing the Frigid Wastelands? Scholar of the First Flame? I think you meant like first sin. You don't even know if you ever found it? Oh, yeah, I think I would have missed Frigid Outskirts. No, actually I don't. Maybe I did miss Frigid Outskirts, and then I like looked back at a guide after I did everything else in Ilium Lois. I think that's what I did. Because even though like I unlocked the coffin to go for it, I just didn't backtrack to it to realize that it was there. Or if I saw it, I might not have gone up to it close enough to realize I could get inside it, like the whole Placidus X thing. Okay, you give the acronym. Okay. And how do you... I thought I saw your name. No, I didn't. I guess I just dyslexia'd. Yeah, the Frigid Outskirts only led to Lud and Zalin. There is the Ring of the Dead, or is it the Ring of the Living in this area, like kind of by the end. There's a couple significant lore items, but having these infinitely spawning angry Keaton is just like ridiculous, especially with the loss of vision in a super white out area. So yeah, as I was thinking about like DS2 and some of FromSoft games more recently, I think I've come to the realization that I tend not to be the fan of like the largest open areas that they have, which is kind of ironic because the swamps don't bother me, but like this does. I mean, even this doesn't really bother me. It's just that there's like not a lot going on, which is just makes it more boring, I suppose. Spaghetti has major respect for DS2 as a Souls game, but also major issues that makes it hard to return to it. Understandable. Alright.
I'm happy at least it wasn't required, but as a Souls player, I want to beat everything, especially if I paid extra for it. Dark Souls 2 is
100%.
still an amazing game, I just think its flaws are much more clear than the other games. Moving on to King Bloodborne, we have the inconvenience. In case you were wondering from what I said in the previous video about what problems caused me not to want to play this game dozens of times, this is it. Without a doubt, my main issue with this game is the healing. I understand what they were doing and it makes sense, it's just such a pain in the early game that it makes the experience less enjoyable for me. Like most people, the first time I played Bloodborne, I was stuck on Father Gascoigne for a while and I had to go back and farm blood vials every single time. It was another problem where I wasn't excited because I beat the boss, I was excited to not have to do 10 minutes of farming in between runs again. Like I said before, this is more of an early game issue, but when I started getting to the more challenging bosses, I was more likely to just die on purpose if I messed up at the beginning of a run because it just wasn't worth wasting any heals. I would have
Yeah, that's a very valid criticism there, especially. And I think to a certain extent, I agree with him. I would just say the economization of items in general, which kind of goes back to what I was talking about with like Dark Souls 1, where it's like if you get killed by an enemy because you're upgrading the wrong weapon, all of that stuff still applies to Bloodborne, but arguably even more so because you have to balance leveling up your character, leveling up your weapon, as well as being able to heal your character and attribute or contribute to their ability to stagger or parry enemies from needing to buy Quicksilver bullets as well, if you aren't at a skill level where you're able to stockpile these things. And this is a bit of a double-edged sword. I think they should have had like a minimum amount that you could have upgraded in the dream, essentially. Like, oh, you make your blood vial bag bigger, you know? Something like that. That could have been an effective way to make Bloodborne work, perhaps, and also give us a kind of stronger metaphysical tie to the dream. But I do kind of appreciate them sticking to their guns and being like, no, like blood is a very physical thing that you need to get from external sources. However, with that being said, the one thing that I will definitely not forgive From Software for doing is making the items arbitrarily scale up in the price from the messenger shop as you go further and further through the game. Like, who knew that the messengers were such venture capitalists in being able to price gouge the hell out of the good hunter once they realize that they're starting to get a higher income? Man, inflation in real life has snuck its way into video games. I don't know. 5 vial minimum. Yeah, that could have been fine. Salty stream tonight? Yeah, a little bit, Stella. No, these are just like the hot takes. You missed the video when we were talking about the best feature in every Souls game. So we're going to have the good and the bad. You take them both, and there you have the facts of From.
I've much rather had them just limit our healing to 5 or 10 vials at the beginning, but have them replenish upon resting, but that's the other issue. You can't rest at the lamps, you have to go all the way back to the hunter's dream if you want to reset, making farming a huge pain, and combined with the tedious load times on PS4, this was more like the hunter's nightmare. The same issue.
Yeah, so at first I was going to disagree with the fact about inconvenience and say the item economy, but I mean, when he brings up the lamps in conjunction with that, I think I could tend to agree more with this, because the item economy does also tie into inconvenience, so maybe inconvenience is a better umbrella term.
Issue goes with bullets, and while this system seems a bit more practical for that aspect, it still caused some hesitation when parrying. I know that they said all of this was designed for a reason, but it doesn't mean that I have to like it. Other than that, I really have no problems with Bloodborne besides the obvious 30 FPS cap, but maybe one day. I think enough people have complained about it by now. Please just remaster the game, FromSoft. Next up, we have Dark.
So Hey You says, hey, you remember the loading times on pre-patched Bloodborne? Lol, Lamau. Yeah. I actually put down Bloodborne because of that. I think at that point I was also getting ready for deployment, so my time was getting consumed, and then like Bloodborne was not helping me wind down after a day, and just the super long loading times. I think it was like unironically like 2 minutes or something, like close to that when it first came out. Not as bad as Summoner 2 on the PlayStation 2, but it just wasn't a fun time if you died. So just, get good and you never have to worry about it, right? Yeah, imagine it on PC. If they did bring Bloodborne to PC. I do wish that they would like give a couple of quality life features to it for sure, but it's a little bit of a slippery slope, especially with like how people feel about Blue Point's remastering of Demon Souls. Oh, Beans and Rice, you're familiar with Summoner 2? My condolences, man. Hey, Killer King, welcome back to the stream. You're yet to find a New Game Plus on any Souls game that you enjoyed? Yeah, that's kind of how I feel. Like, I like it as a novelty, but I don't necessarily like it so much the way that they've been featured. Dark Souls 3.
Dark Souls 3. My reason here is going to contradict myself from other videos, but it's the linear level design. This wasn't a huge problem for me personally, but the level quality also suffered a bit as a result of this. Meaning, most of the levels in the beginning weren't great, and I think at least if they had a bit more branching paths and shortcuts, they would have been a bit more enjoyable. I don't have a problem with the levels being more straightforward since I found myself lost a lot in the other games, but
I think that's a little bit ironic that he wants more shortcuts in Dark Souls 3, whereas I feel like Dark Souls 3 is one of those games where its strengths can double as its weaknesses, and it just kind of comes down to individual preference in how much players enjoyed the more streamlined aspects of Dark Souls 1. Sorry, the streamlined aspects of Dark Souls 3, because DS1 is not streamlined at all almost, other than its level design, versus the more non-linear yet kind of ultimately connecting ways Dark Souls 1 operated. I do think Dark Souls 3's level design is very, very good, but because it returns to having more of the hub system and fast travel enabled from the beginning, there's less incentive to fully explore the world in a way that was similar to Dark Souls 1. And that's something that's super difficult to do. Like, I have seen people do runs of Elden Ring where they don't fast travel because it's kind of more immersive that way. But man, it can be painful getting from point A to point B, which, might kind of go more along the lines of more traditional high fantasy stories like Lord of the Rings. Like 90% of the book is them getting from point A to point B. And then like the Wheel of Time, just like entire chapters are devoted to traveling, and it can be fun. There's a lot of stuff that goes along with it. So like, as they say, when like people are training for events like races and whatnot, quite often it's not really the end outcome that matters as much as it is the journey you took to get there. Obviously that sounds kind of like a platitude, but there really is quite a lot of truth to that. And Dark Souls 3 kind of, I don't want to say like it suffers, but it just doesn't have the same relevance in its level design as Dark Souls 1 does, because it is so streamlined and because you move from point A to point B, which kind of goes back to what Ember was talking about with its linearity. So I do think the Undead Settlement is one of my favorite areas for like a FromSoft game. Central Yarna might actually be my favorite, and these areas are kind of similar in their layout, I guess, because even though like a lot of it is interconnected and it feels just kind of like one big thing, you can kind of have like these very minor like branching differences, and you don't need to go back through each side. So there's a little bit of optional fun you can have if you want to take the time to explore everything. I don't know. You think the best level in DS3 was the church? Are you talking about the Cathedral of the Deep? Yeah, because Cathedral of the Deep is also really good. DS3's aesthetic, not aesthetic, is too muddy and gray too. Visually, you have trouble keeping track of a lot of enemies against backgrounds compared to the other games. Ponyboy, are you colorblind at all? I'm not like trying to like put you down or anything. I'm just curious because that's something that I've heard like a lot of people complain about DS3 as well. Just like the saturation and how brown and gray it is. So I'm curious if like color blindness plays a part of that at all. Too many bonfires in DS3. Killer King's worst part of DS3 was the lore, especially the DLC. You even put off getting into the Elden Ring lore for the longest time because of that. Glad you got into Elden Ring lore eventually. I don't know. So the way that I always talk about the Dark Souls games is I think 1 has the best world building by far. I think 2 has the best micro lore in terms of like how it sets up the mechanics of like light and dark and hollowing and stuff like that. And then I think 3 for me has the best macro lore in terms of like thematics, in terms of bringing an end to the series and giving us a capstone on the saga of light and dark and the ability to let go. Well, I can totally understand why it can be dissatisfying for like a lot of people, because I've kind of have more familiarity with like Buddhism and Eastern like philosophy and religions. It just kind of made the most sense to me that the series went out the way that it did, especially like when you compare it to, or especially when you think of it as a continuation of what came before. Like, there is going to eventually be an end of everything, or of, whatever you're talking about. So it kind of makes sense to me that DS3 and like the Dark Souls universe would have its own end. Yeah, the 2 visible bonfires at the living armor. The Dragon Slayer armor, yeah, those ones always felt a little bit redundant to me. Hey, Billy Caldwell, welcome to the stream. You agree that the theming is great, but the details feel so retconny. For better or worse. And like I said, I feel like Dark Souls 3's strengths are its weaknesses, because Dark Souls 3 iterates the best on all of the games that came before it, obviously before Elden Ring in many regards. And its weakness is that it doesn't push things further. So it polishes what was already there to a super high degree, which is what I talked about in my DS3 review, but it doesn't help define itself as being a standalone experience from the other games. So you're either a fan of the fan service or you're not, and that's just kind of how I feel like the whole game shapes up. You're either more on board with the fan service or you're more on board with wanting something new, and it just doesn't differentiate itself other than on its like combat mechanics. All right, going back to the vid, otherwise we're gonna get lost in the weeds all night long.
I didn't like how much they strayed away from their original level design philosophy. I think they picked it up a bit after Abyss Watchers, but it was just hard for me to enjoy the lesser quality levels knowing there weren't really any other paths to take. Aside from this, I have to mention the fan service, since I know a lot of people were upset about this when the game first came out. I didn't have a ton of issues with it, but Dark Souls 3 was also the first Souls game I played. Going back, I can see how people were annoyed by this, but I think it was a really good way to end the Dark Souls series, and the DLC more than made up for it. I do think it was a little bit too easy to R1 spam through most of the basic enemies as well, but it didn't really hurt the game too much, especially since the bosses weren't affected by this. I think it's probably the best starter Souls game for a newbie, maybe even more so than Elden Ring, and it just kind of felt like that's what they were going for. Also, since it was the one that got me into the series, it's hard for me to hate on it too much. Moving on to my
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that he says that this might be more noob-friendly than Elden Ring. Like, I'm kind of inclined to agree, but I don't really know. I should probably, like, hop into more people's streams of, like, Elden Ring being their first Soulsborne experience, perhaps. Because Elden Ring is one of those games where it's kind of as hard as you make it to be, whereas, like, Dark Souls 3 is like, no, you're going to do things my way, or else, you're going to go hollow. Elden Ring can facilitate better experiences perhaps for newer players if they use things like Spirit Ashes, or Ashes of War. Those can really help players. Yeah, I just don't know, but I think it might depend on like the kind of player. Like, if Dark Souls 3 clicks with a newer player, it's probably a better streamlined experience. I would agree with that. Whereas Elden Ring can maybe be a bit too open-ended and not provide enough guidance, ironically enough, for newer players. And part of the reason I say that is on my 1.0 playthrough of Elden Ring, which I like streamed a couple months back or something like that, I wanted to try to recreate a potential new player experience by like following the sites of grace as closely as possible. And man, holy crap, is it really unfair to have completely new players to the franchises be exposed to the Tree Sentinel, although I avoided fighting him because the guidance kind of sends you a little bit to the left of him and he is avoidable. But also Margit, they're just kind of ridiculously difficult for brand new players, perhaps, if they don't use Spirit Ashes. But anyway, I digress. Okay, Ponyboy isn't colorblind. Okay, I was just curious. Thanks for letting me know. Scaleezy says the roll spam in 3 is kind of wild, to be honest. Like, no way that would fly in DS1. True story. Gunder turned so many people away? Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess he is a little bit difficult, but I think he's a pretty good tutorial boss. But I also definitely had experience by the time I fought him. As a newcomer to the series, you feel like Elden Ring would not be that accommodating. Yeah, I think Elden Ring, because it's so big, it does give players more time to familiarize themselves with the concepts of the game, but it still has the classic issue of players wanting to diversify their builds and kind of harm themselves in the long run. At least Elden Ring can still allow players to overlevel content pretty comfortably for the most part. But yeah, I guess if you get randomly teleported to Caelid and have no idea what the hell's going on, it can make for a bit of a rough experience. Because that is in like the Dragon Burnt Ruins, like right next to the spawn, which is kind of hilarious. Heyu's biggest gripe about 3 are the Mad Phantoms. They should have allowed Purple Phantoms to invade boss arenas and act as a true wild card. It was by far the most fun you had when the bug was around. Yeah, I remember seeing like a bunch of vids of like people hopping into the boss arenas and like more or less doing some silly stuff, whether or not they were like casting the warmth spell on the boss or the player, stuff like that. Elden Ring is the best first game for people that have already played the other games. Maybe. You might be right about that. So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting question that Ember kind of inadvertently raised here. Ponyboy says, remind you, getting slingshotted to Caelid, was that the same teleport into the mines? Yes. So that sends you into the Caelid crystal tunnel with the falling star beast in it. And man, that was a rude awakening for me. Holy crap. I was legitimately convinced people would not be able to like no-hit the game because of that stupid boss in that stupid arena. And also just had like a ridiculous amount of health. Like I was able to chip down the enemies in there. It was kind of difficult, but it was manageable. But the Falling Star Beast was its own beast entirely. Pun intended. Billy Caldwell regrets respecing so much to experiment in their first playthrough, since it made going back less interesting with the exploration and lore incentives. Yeah, as I've said before on previous streams, I feel like Elden Ring is definitely the best first experience of a Soulsborne game, but the more you play it, the worse it gets. Whereas like Dark Souls 3 especially still kind of holds up on subsequent playthroughs. Obviously, it's smaller, so there's less content, but I feel like all of the previous games are a little bit more curated than Elden Ring. But that's of course if you incorporate like the whole open world aspect into it and kind of overlook the, what are they called? Relic dungeons? Legacy dungeons.
Precious baby,
hey Ava, welcome
we
to the
have
stream.
Sekiro. This is honestly
Again.
the closest thing we've ever had to a perfect game in my opinion, because I really can't think of anything wrong with it. I know a lot of people have issues with the lack of build variety and the game forcing you to play a specific way, but the game just wouldn't work with anything else. I do wish they added at least a few.
I would disagree with that, with the idea that it wouldn't work any other way else. I mean, it wouldn't work any other way else within this paradigm here, but the Shinobi tools could have been more effective. I feel like the item economy is absolute trash in Sekiro, like many of the other FromSoft games. Like Spirit Emblems, why? You could just have a like spawning max number of tools to use, so that way, like, hey, you get 10 shuriken or like 9 shuriken if you want like a I was going to say a round number, but most people think of 10. But anyway, maybe like 3 firecrackers per life or something like that, or 5 firecrackers. Like, there are ways they could have implemented the economy, but I feel like the reason that they used spirit emblems and all this other stuff is because they wanted players to still be rewarded for exploring levels, and they didn't have enough stuff to flesh that out. So I think somebody, was it in the chat or the Discord a while back, made the point that Elden Ring is a good game, but it fails to be like an actual action game. It tries to stay more of an RPG, and it kind of suffers for it. And I kind of agree with that assessment there. And also, as far as like item economization goes, like the snap seeds, I think you can literally only get a maximum of 5 or 6 to fight Lady Butterfly at the very beginning. And if you die more than that or use them too often, you're kind of screwed. Sort of, like, you don't need them, but it's super unintuitive how that works. Like, that could have just been a non-consumable item, like, why? And same thing with the Divine Confetti. It only lasts 30 seconds rather than until, like, death. It's just silly. Especially because, like, you only get a super small amount of them early on. So, you need to either kill the Shichimen warrior in a very few amount of tries, or wait until, like, later in the game. Anyway. Spirit emblems ruined your experience, felt like you were drowning. Yeah. What the hell is this spirit emblem lore-wise? Why/how are they used for the prosthetic? Well, that's a good question. I mean, a spirit emblem is a katashiro, which is obviously like a spirit emblem, but what's the word? Damn it, I get like hitogata, person shape, effigy. Okay, yeah, effigy. So, spirit emblems are effigies of like people who've died. I think there's a cut version of the spirit emblem description. Let's see if I can. I think I have it because I mentioned it, or like I used it on my review. So this might make it a little bit more clear if you had questions about it. So, white spirit emblem, a white paper doll required for using prosthetic tools. White spirit emblems harbor the souls of the dead. Only a shinobi could find a use for such a thing. So, why can Sekiro use this? Lore? I don't know. It's just kind of like a Japanese Shinto feature. You can kind of see a similar type thing show up in Spirited Away. So, it's just like these kind of represent an effigy of a person, so that way they aren't cursed by worse things, essentially. And so they are deflecting their curses or their bad karma onto this paper effigy which represents them, which I guess Sekiro can make use of for whatever reason, because he also has to accept the karma of like killing the people that he's encountering as he performs his ninja missions. If that makes sense. Divine Confetti was really poorly implemented. Made the headless fights way too tedious. Agreed. Okay, going back to the video here.
Few different weapons, even if they were just for New Game Plus, like the spears that some of the enemies have, but this didn't bother me too much. Like I said in the previous video, a super heavy strength build or magic in this game just wouldn't work due to the flow of combat. The real biggest problem I have with this game is more of a personal thing, but if you'd rather me point out a specific problem, I could say the spirit emblems, because I think they should just be free. Finding these in the world is a pain, and money isn't super easy to come across if you want to buy them, and not to mention the price actually goes up the more you buy. This made me not want to experiment with prosthetic tools or certain skills as much because I was too concerned about running out of spirit emblems.
Holy crap, I actually didn't know that the prices of them increased. That's so trash, to just say it bluntly. Luckily enough, FromSoft has beaten me down and conditioned me into never wanting to use any items, so I just never knew that? What is going on here?
And it's not like you can...
I even lost my chat. That's super cool. That's strange. All right, give me a second. Let me close this out and try to open it up. All right, I think we're good again. What was I saying? Oh, he was talking about spirit emblems. They cost more. Oh, yeah, the other thing that I did want to mention in relation to the paradigm of how combat worked, like I was saying earlier, I think on his last video, that if they gave us more tools or more ways to implement the tools, you didn't necessarily have to rely on parrying in like making this combat. And they could have eased up on the poise system to some degree or made more methods to inflict poise damage or HP damage. So they could have done more, which isn't to say what they have is bad. It's just very one-dimensional, which is both Sekiro's greatest strength and greatest weakness, depending on how you feel about it. Yeah, that does kind of happen with buying blood vials, but it's more limited to picking up badges and like beating bosses. So it's a similar principle. I'm surprised that it was in Sekiro that way too. You thought it increased with story progression like Bloodborne? It might be. So he might have just like misspoke. I don't know. I never really bought spirit emblems until like maybe the end game when I like had a bunch of more tools and I was just playing around with them. Yeah, Sekiro has like 3 or 4 upgrade paths that you need to keep on top of. So if you didn't have to pay for so many of these things, I think I would have been more comfortable experimenting with a lot of the prosthetics. But to be fair, like as soon as you pick up the firecrackers, like super early on in the game, it's pretty much game over. You don't need anything else. There's like maybe 2 or 3 other that are like actually essential for completing some things with relative ease, but firecrackers just trivialize a lot of things. Like when you can get a free stun on Sword Saint Ishin or the other form of Ishin to break some of their more deadly attacks, it's just free real estate at that point. You forget to press the send vacuum.
You can use an infinite amount of these. I believe you can only get a max of like 20 per life, so it doesn't make sense why you would need to buy them. That's more of a nitpick, and I'm sure they had their reasons, but my real issue with this game is the learning curve. It is impossible to get anyone into this game without them completing basically the first half, and then it just starts to make sense. It might be because I couldn't get out of my button mashing habit from the other Souls games, but it took me 3 attempts of trying this game for me to finally get into it. And even then, the combat didn't click for me until I'd beaten the entire game, even though they're clearly trying to push you to use the right approach throughout the entire experience.
Yeah, so one of the funniest bosses that I've seen people just absolutely crash on and get wrecked on in Sekiro is the mini boss before Genichiro in Ashina Castle. I don't even remember if he has a name. I'm sure he does, but I just don't remember what it is. The little EI Jutsu using samurai over here. The one that will literally, I mean, I just said it. He literally does the EI strike where his sword is sheathed and then he will unsheath it and then strike like 6 times in rapid succession. So you need to parry like 6 times in a row. But for people who are just awful at the parry timing, that is like the first wall boss for them that they just can't overcome because it's all entirely dependent on the parry mechanic. But what I really wanted to talk about was, I think Sekiro's learning curve is definitely the steepest in all of the games. And I feel like Genichiro is probably the best boss that FromSoft has made or designed because he is such a pain in the ass if you don't cheese him, obviously. And you really have to master the basics of combat to beat him, like literally every little thing. So the Mikiri counter, potentially using Shuriken if he jumps in the air, although if you don't, that's totally understandable. Being able to Goomba Stomp is a viable mechanic that a lot of people probably aren't going to pick up at that point. So we're like jumping over his strikes and being able to avoid the death mark grabs, essentially, the danger marks. You just need to be very comfortable with all of the combat basics, which is a very, very difficult task. Like it took me an extremely long time to beat Genichiro the first time I did it. And then not only does it make you master all those little basics, it's like, nope, screw you, buddy. Learn this new mechanic too. Eat some lightning. It's it was a bit of an experience because I thought I finally beat him and I got, nah, son, there's more of him. Two Hit, welcome back to the stream. You said the learning curve is also the deepest because it's the most narrow gameplay. You play a certain way or you don't play the game. Exactly. So, another case of its strength being its weakness. Having ADHD means you have to force yourself to be laser focused on Genichiro, which is super tiring. And yeah, I think that's a valid criticism. I thought ADHD wouldn't be as bad because you get the immediate feedback loop reward, so it kind of keeps the dopamine level flowing, but I'm interested to hear that perspective as well. He was cooking the whole time you were mastering your basics. And yeah, even like the best part to me is after you get your ass beat by Genichiro and all the other bosses and or Ishin or the Demon of Hatred, if you do like a new game plus or just even another new game, you the player have leveled up and you can go ahead and beat Genichiro the very first time you load up the game, you know? So that's one of the things that I adore about like a lot of the FromSoft games where before I ever played like a FromSoft game, I was really itching for a game where it felt like the player was leveling up rather than the character, and then these games kind of all came out. So obviously the games themselves have leveling mechanics, but Sekiro definitely does the most in leveling up the player. Like your skills, it's kind of like riding a bike. I mean, you'll definitely forget a lot of things, don't get me wrong, but you'll remember a lot as well. It depends on what kind of things catch your hyperfixation. Okay. Killer King still surprised this game won Game of the Year. Elden Ring is a no-brainer, but Sekiro seems so niche and heavily skill-based, there's no way it would get it. You were pleasantly surprised. I was honestly disappointed, not because I think like Sekiro didn't deserve it, but I mean, this game came out and competed against Smash Brothers Ultimate. And man, I just didn't expect it to win because like Smash feels like way more of a complete game to me, despite like, you know, all that other stuff. I think it's probably because there's been so many iterations of Smash and it's seen more as a party game than something that's a bit more narratively driven. But this did also compete against what's it called? Death Stranding. I'm like, Last Man Stranding? That doesn't make any sense. No, so it competed against Death Stranding, and I thought this was definitely better, but it was just a very interesting year. So I'm not entirely surprised it won, but I did feel as though Smash was technically the better game, if that makes sense.
Even though they're clearly trying to push you to use the right approach throughout the entire experience. Like I said, this is a super personal thing, but for some reason it's hard to understand what people mean when they say it's a rhythm game until later, which prevents so many people from experiencing this masterpiece. And speaking of masterpiece, why not say hello to Elden Ring? This one was tough because while I've discussed my gripes with Elden Ring in the past, there really wasn't one big thing I think they did the worst. But then I realized there definitely is, the difficulty balance. And hear me out, I don't mean that it's too easy or too hard. I actually think it's both of these. The worst part about Elden Ring, in my opinion, is the inconsistency of difficulty through bosses and areas.
So I would need to think of what I think would be the worst feature of Elden Ring, but I do agree with his statement overall here that just the scaling of the game was a bit perplexing to say the least, especially like if you get teleported to Caelid, that's one thing. But if you go from the southern part of Caelid and just cross a little gap in the chasm to the Dragon Barrow, you're going from like a level 40 area to like a level 120 area. And there's absolutely no indication of that other than you literally being stomped to death by dragons or all that other stuff. It's just very unexpected. Or I guess like tying into that, if you warp from the Third Church of America and you meet this valiant gargoyle, Good luck, kid. Get good, get wrecked. You know, I mean, it's just a bit of a head spin at times.
To be fair, since it's open world, there's not really any solution for this. It's just one of the negatives that come with these types of games. I found myself incredibly disappointed when I went through a dungeon I didn't find until the later game just to one-shot the boss in 3 seconds. It would have been cool if enemies and bosses scaled with your level a little bit, but then it would have defeated the purpose they created for new players to be able to leave and come back when they're a higher level. But the problem with the difficulty goes both ways. There are extremely broken weapons in the game that make it significantly easier, and some weapons that aren't even really viable. Nothing in the
Yeah, when I went through Elden Ring my first time, I'd heard, I mean, because I was exploring pretty much every area almost to completion, so I got to Millennia pretty late in comparison to like the very beginning rush of like trying to complete the game as quickly as possible. So I'd heard that she was like the most difficult boss by far. I think I was level 142 when I fought her, which is, you know, kind of respectable. Not ridiculously over-leveled, not under-leveled either, so I was probably like in a sweet spot there. And since I knew she was the most difficult, I just decided to stop leveling up after that, so that way I just didn't continue to outscale things. Hey Donut, thanks for the comment there. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, so it's kind of fun to look at a bit of a variety of topics of this. Not all of it is lore, but thanks for sticking with me. I appreciate that. Hey, you overall agrees the first 80% was super easy and the last 20% was a giant spike. Yeah, as soon as you get through the Forbidden Land, it's like, welcome to the end game, son. And then it just kind of kicks it up. And yeah, going back to like the whole idea of like the open worlds and not, or open areas and not liking them, I think I might be a little bit traumatized by just how sparse and oddly balanced the mountaintops were as well. You wish Elden Ring's menus are more stylized like DS3's. You also think that the sight of grace icons make the map look ugly as you progress through the game. You wish they were more transparent or maybe able to be hid. That's kind of an interesting thought as well. And I kind of agree with that to a certain extent. That the map is a little bit busy. I did like the ability to add more to the map with the HUD and stuff. And in some ways, I do wish they took away some of those quality of life features to make the map a bit more interactive and make players use it. So
this game is a
I come this sounds weird. So like when I was growing up, the games were a lot more difficult because they couldn't have as much information packed into them. So I come from like a time of like playing NES games like Wizardry, or I'm trying to think of the title of this one game where you're like a family going around trying to explore this like labyrinth underneath their house. It was really weird. But anyway, like any of those like old style Castlevania games or the more obtuse games like the original Zelda, you just kind of had to like figure stuff out. And back then, like me and my mom would like make maps trying to keep track of our progress and like know what we were doing. And that's just kind of something that we've definitely moved away from with the gaming community, for better and for worse. And as somebody was saying like on the stream last night, people were like looking up guides 3 days after the game got released. So it's just completely different experience in terms of like how we approach games collectively nowadays compared to way back then. Yeah, I'm old. Dascal, okay. Yeah, I'm pretty bad at remembering who says what, unfortunately. Yeah, throwback to having the notebook next to you while playing.
challenge if you use Rivers of Blood the whole way through, but that's fine, that's your choice. The real problem is the spirit summons, another thing that is supposedly your choice, but not really. Do you think they designed the Godskin duo assuming everyone would want to fight them fairly and get stomped on over and over, or do you think they designed them in hopes that you would use a summon? That's why the difficulty balance feels a bit strange sometimes, because you feel more forced to use items to help you than you normally would. This wasn't a huge issue in Elden Ring, but it was definitely the worst aspect of that game.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a fair statement for the most part. The idea of like the Godskins and the duos, the way that I approached Elden Ring is that I would fight bosses mano a mano if they were one boss. But if they had like a twin or a buddy to help them, I'm like, oh no, I got my friend too. So I felt bad. Okay, I remember. So when I first started, I explored like a lot of Limgrave, and then I went up to Liurnia and upgraded the hell out of my weapons. No, that's not true. I didn't know where the bell bearing was, so I tried to go up to Liurnia to see EG, but I couldn't upgrade my weapon +2 because I didn't go into the mine in Limgrave. So I explored like a lot of Caelid and the Weeping Peninsula, and I was missing the crucial ingredient to get like a +3 weapon, which is really stupid. But anyway, I fought Margit, went to Stormvale and all that. But when I fought Margit, I did summon on my first playthrough, and I just kind of pub stomped him, and I felt really bad about doing that, so I kind of stopped summoning after Margit. And then after that, after Stormvale, or maybe before Godric, no, I think it was after Godric. Yeah. After Godric, I did eventually go get the bell bearing in Liurnia, and I was able to upgrade my +2 weapon to a +14 weapon. So to kind of go along with what he's saying about the scaling of difficulty, I really do wish the merchants had either more weapon options available to kind of give players a hint as to what they should expect for the surrounding areas, and or upgrades that correspond with that kind of area. So if they just had like smithing stone +5 and +4 for a certain spot that you could buy, that would give players a lot more indication of what to expect, provided they found those merchants. You despise Radigan's fight. The baiting and punishing for it is infuriating. I actually really like his fight because he's a hammer user, a one-handed hammer user, and he's difficult, but not unfair, and like he doesn't have like a bunch of unstoppable or like a bunch of ridiculously chaining combos like Margit is kind of bad about that. Yeah, Margit is definitely bad about that, / Morgott, in terms of like the combos that never end or things to interrupt you from attacking him. I really like Moog. Radigan? No, not Radigan. Radahn can kind of be bad melee, but at this point in the game, I just kind of overpower Radahn because I know the strats against him. I'm trying to think. Oh, Millennia, duh, obviously. Well, no, she's kind of slow. Rykard's a gimmick boss. Anyway, I think Margit is probably like the worst for having like a ridiculous amount of combos and punishing. Revenant says, it's been criticized for being repetitive, but fighting the Elden Ring dragons with the Stormblade skill or the Lightning Spear locked onto their heads is the most fun you've had with dragons in all of the Souls. I haven't done that yet, and I'm kind of over the dragon experience, unfortunately. They just play extremely similarly, and I've already done that a lot. Something like 80% of people's first ending was Ronnie's, which kind of goes to show how bad the issue of using guides was instead of exploring on your own has gotten. Kind of yes and no. I could have done Ronnie's ending, but I chose the Duskborn ending instead, and I was disappointed. Yeah, Malekith, that's another one for like... So not Malekith himself, but Geraint. Oh my god, the combos that he uses are just like, bro, chill. He really is a beast. Okay, so I was originally going to watch 3 more videos by Ember because I thought, hey, these are short, we'll get through them quickly. But no, we've been going hard in the paint for some of these comments. So I'm going to go ahead and kick Quelaag's video up next because this is about 40 minutes and I'll probably, talk for about just as long. So we'll probably go a little bit longer on the stream, which we've been doing a bit consistently anyway. So, yeah. I do really enjoy these videos by Ember. There's been a lot of fun topics to talk about. We might continue the next 3 tomorrow or something like that. I'll just, figure out how to balance things as we go. So if you guys enjoyed his videos, go ahead and give him a like and or a sub if you feel he deserves it. I'm sure he'd appreciate it. The link is in the chat now. Rav's Rabble pulled the classic Firekeeper ending where he saw the summon sign and said, "Ooh, what's this?" Stella said, "You had a walkthrough guide for Riven when you were a kid and you remember it being split into a section that was more hints if you got stuck and one that was in depth. Guide should be like that." Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. I mean, nowadays people be like, spoiler warning, go to this section timestamped on the screen now if you want to avoid spoilers. So there's kind of stuff like that to a certain extent, but very thoughtful of the guide makers for that. All right. So those were Ember's best and worst features of the Souls games, including Elden Ring. Now we shall transition into some more hard lore topics and a little bit of schadenfreude with Quelaag's Elden Ring history and how it broke me. So I like a lot of Quelaag's videos. I haven't watched too many of hers, but she's got a very grounded approach, which I feel is pretty similar to mine. We might have a lot of disagreements here, so I'm kind of curious to see how Elden Ring history has broke her, because it's kind of broken me as well. So we can say it's either schadenfreude or me commiserating with this experience heading into this video. So I'm very curious as to what she says. If it ever loads.
I need help.
Let me turn this up.
I need help. I need help. I need help. I can't. I can't do this anymore. I can't. I just can't. I'm having a crisis about this video. This is my second iteration of it, and I started working on this timeline where I was comparing the art that's in Elden Ring to the art of real-life statues and obelisks and architecture and alphabets.
Wait. She actually found the ones? I was wondering where this came from. Oh, maybe it's a little bit different, but it does look similar. Okay. Yeah, no, this seems like an extremely ambitious project here. Obviously, I've looked at the timeline of Elden Ring. I haven't tried to connect it to the real world stuff because, quite frankly, my knowledge of archaeology is lacking on that subject. I do wish I knew more about archaeology and art history, but I mean, it's just a lot of history to go through, and it does take a lot of resources to delve into it in a way where you're getting a kind of quality education. So, anyway, you take this over making sense of Odin and the doll any day? Well, I disagree. Anyway, going back to the video.
And everything, and it doesn't stop. And it's gotten to the point where I've hit France and Spain and the UK and Asia and China, Japan, Asia Minor, just fucking all over the place. I've hit everything. I've hit it all. I've hit every fucking civilization up to the 1600s, and I'm losing my fucking mind. The only things that I can't find are Aztec and Incan and Mayan architecture, but there's that Brazilian folklore with the eyeball plant that's even in the game. So
yeah, not to say like I told you so, especially not to her because we haven't really interacted before. But this is kind of why I tend to push away a lot of visual references, not references, but just like a lot of visual symbolism that accompanies FromSoft games, because it is so difficult trying to determine what was intentional, what is unintentional, what came from FromSoft directly versus what came from like third-party vendors or like reused assets or just cost-saving measures. So for anybody who isn't like too familiar with like a lot of the more niche topics on my channel, I have made a video about like the art in Bloodborne specifically. I don't remember if I talk about it in that video or not, but I remember bringing this up in response to some other streams, especially that FromSoft is kind of notorious for reusing their assets and getting them from online vendors, which, I mean, that's just part of game development. You can't do absolutely every little thing in-house, like designing the quatrefoils of every little thing. They did when they were making Bloodborne. They went to like Prague and parts of Europe, probably to examine the architecture of things like the clock towers there, a more Eastern European environment, as well as Notre Dame, because we have some features from the Notre Dame appear in like the chapels and Bloodborne and whatnot. So let me see if I have, what's it called? What did I label it as? Statue? Or probably relief. Okay. Oh, I have it bookmarked. That should be good enough. So, in Bloodborne, this relief here is taken from something that I found online. I have it here. So this is a stock photo of a real thing. And then I found this 3D image of it on a site called TurboSquid. TurboSquid.co. I didn't mean to open that like twice. So let me try to pull that up. Turbo. Let's do this. I think this will take me to what I need. So yeah, this is the exact 3D model that we saw on that relief statue thing. And you can buy it for yourself for $44. So I do know for a fact that they probably incorporate third-party tools because they're listed in their game credits and stuff. So it makes it very difficult for me to know what is supposed to be what in terms of like its significance. And some of this stuff gets reused in their games. I'm kind of repeating myself, which I apologize for, but in Dark Souls 1, there is a bunch of like graves or like sarcophagi in the catacombs, and their design on the sides of the catacombs also get reused in Bloodborne. In Fair Missoula, we have like the Chloranthy design looking thing appear in, what's it called? In Lane Dell, right before the Erdtree Sanctuary, or in the Erdtree Sanctuary. It's actually in the throne, right with like Morgott as well. And that's a design that we can see in Archdragon Peak. I think I have it somewhere listed. Oh no, that I took footage of, so I'm going to have to use a different folder. Give me a second here. Where am I at? What folder did I even put this in? Okay. So this design appears in Dark Souls 3. We've got our Elite Knight set wearing dude. This is in front of like Osiris's place. It appears in Lane Dell. So it's just super difficult trying to piece all this stuff together. So I do not envy her endeavors here. And with her just saying that they span like pretty much every culture, it makes me less willing to entertain this stuff super seriously, even if I think like a lot of it is super fascinating. So yeah, going off on that tangent there. And Elden Enthusiast, I saw you hop in. Welcome back to the stream. Nice to see you again. You're glad that there are people like Quelaag and Tarnished Archaeologists that do that, though? Yeah, I agree. Even if I don't necessarily agree with their conclusions, I always appreciate the effort and them sharing their knowledge of these kinds of subjects. True story, Spaghetti. And you don't see how comparing architecture to real life has ever been relevant to the lore, in your opinion? Building every game from the ground up would take forever. So part of the reason it can be useful to look at some of their architectural influences is that you can kind of get an understanding of their themes or the thematics of certain areas. Like even though you can kind of intuit in Dark Souls 1 that Lost Izalith just feels more chaotic, you can actually see that there's developer intent with them looking at the ruins of Java and using those to inspire their architecture in Izalith as well. So there is value to it. It just kind of varies on a person-to-person basis. And like in Dark Souls 3, the Archdragon Peak Cathedral is based off like the Hagia Sophia, which, if I'm remembering my history correctly, she's probably going to talk about it. And, well, that's the DS3 thing. Never mind. If I'm remembering correctly, it was originally a mosque that got converted into use for Christendom, and then it got converted back to a mosque. Or maybe it was originally Christian, but in a more Persian style design, and then got converted into a mosque. I don't remember. Either way, the important thing about like the Hagia Sophia and it being represented in Archdragon Peak is that it does show a marked difference from the architecture used in places like Anor Londo or Irithyll. So it does give you a kind of sense that this is supposed to be a different culture or a different way of doing things than the cultures of Anor Londo and Irithyll and all that kind of thing. Chadwick asks, isn't Dark Souls 2 sort of emblematic of assets having taken their meaning shifted around late in development? And that's also the thing that's a real pain in the ass to try to figure out, like, what got shifted around in development and whether or not the developers thought about, like, what the ramifications are of moving things around so late in development, if they overlooked anything that made more sense when things were placed in different areas and stuff like that. Which doesn't answer your question directly. I'm not super familiar with like the nitty gritty of DS2's development, other than knowing like it was very troubled and they did what they could. It's like the Bass Pro Shop pyramid, neat, possibly a little chaotic, but probably doesn't have a deeper meaning than how it looks. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel for the most part, except I do wonder about specific tidbits, which I like to share when I can. Killer King says there is value, but you feel like the conclusions usually give more weight to their outside research than the in-game text and dialogue. Yeah, I agree with that, which is why I tend to be skeptical and keep this at like an arm's length away if I can help it. Alfarius, nice to see you again. Okay, so you said Hagia Sophia was Christian, then made it into a mosque when the Turks took Constantinople, aka Istanbul. Thank you. That's what I thought, and I thought I was wrong, but thank you for the confirmation.
It's really difficult for me to even want to stop, like, looking. And it's getting to the point where it's actually taking up a lot of my free time after my 40-hour-a-week job that I have, my adult-ass adult job that I have. And it's driving me a little bit nuts. So, you know, we're just gonna have a crisis. I'm gonna have my dancing alien guys to keep me company, to keep the levity going. Dancing to Dragon Quest while we talk about ancient history and prehistory. So before I talked about the Silurian era and the Ordovician era. Ordovician.
So Ava said, you're sorry, but you gotta disagree with chat because with outside research, it can matter more than we may realize. That's true, but sometimes it's also, they can also lead into like a couple bits of dead ends. So like with what she brings up here with the Silurian and Ordovician extinction periods, I was like, holy crap, Siluria and Ordovis are related to like something historically relevant. Does this tie into the Crucible? Does the Crucible tie into like sea life and then tree life? No. So I don't want to say like I wasted my time, but it just didn't have as much relevance as I initially expected there to be, which is perfectly fine, but it's just kind of like one of those things where you don't know until you know. You know?
Whatever. This one that I can't pronounce is the one where fungus appears, and the fungus is really weird. It is tall like a tree. It's really weird and kind of creeps me out. It's also the era in which tectonic plate movements happened so bad and so big that it actually created a lot of the mountaintop peaks that we know.
So I don't mean to like keep pausing, and I'll probably try to let her talk a lot more after this one. I didn't know this thing about the fungus, and my initial impressions after looking at this specifically is that it kind of reminds me of the gigantic stumps in the consecrated snowfields, and obviously down in the Shifra River area with the Mogun Dynasty area, and the spot that kind of looks like the Elden Ring arena between the aqueduct and Nokron proper and the Night Sacred Ground.
And love today. The tallest mountains, in fact, were created during this period. Another really cool era is the Silurian era, which is when we get terrestrial vascular plants that have vascular tissue that are able to produce fruit. So that's pretty cool, especially because the Crucible Knights have these naming conventions. And the Silurian era has like a tree crown, a tree helmet. So you love it. You love to see it. Little references. That was like almost 500 million years ago. We need to rewind several million years into early human prehistory. Ancient history, not prehistory. Prehistory is this stuff. We're talking about early human history. Here's the Stone Age when we are really dumb and we don't have language. We don't know how to use tools. We're like super, super dumb. Maybe we use like a stick or a rock, but for the most part, we just like are big dumb idiots, and that's established in Elden Ring by the era of the dragons and the beasts. They talk about how beasts didn't have intelligence, and so they used rocks or something. But for the most part, that's pretty much it. There's a lot of myths about this era too, in like our human history, and like modern, like real life humans, not Elden Ring humans. We have a lot of myths about this age regarding how, man man was in the Garden of Eden, and we ate an apple, and then we gained knowledge, the knowledge of God and of our own sin and shame and a bunch of other stuff. In Greek mythology, there's Prometheus who gave us the fire of knowledge. There's a lot of myths about us gaining knowledge and bad shit happening. Oh, the Tower of Babel falling because we got too close to God, because we built too good and our language was all unified and too good, and so God was like, none of that, and split us up. There's a lot about...
Alright, so Scowl Easy made a really interesting comment in the chat that I'll read out loud for anybody who is just listening along, in that dead trees didn't rot for a couple million years there, then that microorganisms didn't develop the enzymes to break down trees for a while. I didn't know that, which, I mean, it kind of makes a lot of sense, and then that does make me wonder about, like, scarlet rot in comparison, but I don't really think that's, like, super relevant. Or maybe it is. Maybe it shows, like, the petrified trees come from an era without rot. Alright, hey, you take care. Have a good night, and thanks for dropping in.
Although that wasn't Stone Age. That wasn't Stone Age era. That was referring to Sumerians and Babylon. But anyway, what's happening right here? What's happening? Who are the Sumerians? Why are they important? Why do they come after the Stone Age, and why are they so important? Well, it's because they're the creators of modern civilization as we know it. They were the first ones who came up with cuneiform, which is one of the first alphabets, and it was actually used to establish laws and to tell stories about our ancestors and about conquest, or it was sometimes used to talk about how many grains of rice we sold, how many cows we had. It was used for really practical things. And the neat thing about cuneiform is that it actually shows up in Elden Ring in multiple places. It shows up in the Palace of Uld on any of the obelisks and steels. A couple of other images that show up on the steels refer to other cultures as well. We have what looks like Minoan culture right here. We have a good old Nordic Viking Yggdrasil root tree motif over here with some beasts kind of tangled up in the roots.
Which is kind of why I say it's difficult for me to take a lot of the visual imagery as being extremely significant, just because there's a non-zero chance that this kind of material came from a non-from software sourced company just to kind of fit their quota for assets they needed to fill in some gaps here and there. But, maybe it is supposed to be relevant sometimes. So I say that in relation to these things, although I do think like the Babylonian map of the world, or Mesopotamian map of the world with like the so-called Elden John statue is probably actually meant to be a bit more significant. And why that one? I don't really have a good reason that could justify that statue being more significant than the others, other than it kind of being placed a bit more prominently and seeming more intentional with its placement than like these things, I guess.
This is Mycenaean, the Lion's Gate that sits outside of the Mycenaean palace or citadel. And it looks like it's accompanied by the primordial flame or the primordial current on top of this little thingy that they have. I don't know. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But we also, we have the obelisk. And the really interesting thing is that this specific obelisk is definitely modeled after the black obelisk that's from Sumer, but the images are different. So the artist, the concept artist, or whoever worked on this 3D model made a point to copy this obelisk down to the cuneiform that's at the base of this shit. Like, there's cuneiform right there. But this artist was like really on point. They were like, I really want to copy this obelisk, but then the images are ever so slightly different. Same with the Mycenaean references too. And it actually looks like it depicts ships coming over from like across the sea. A couple of people tending to a tree or tending to multiple trees. Some kind of ceremony that either looks like a baptism, maybe the preparation of like a dead body. I'm not quite sure, but it looks like several people standing around a table. This looks like people in front of an altar, and then this is actually a series of columns with statues between them that you can actually find down in the Lake of Rot, which is really cool. There's some like little in-game hints and references in.
I don't think I saw those statues in the Lake of Rot. I wonder if those are like in between the pillars in the building down there. I'll probably need to double check that.
In this, and these little clues. So, kind of after the Sumerian culture, there was the Assyrians and the Akkadians. I don't know if I'm pronouncing their name right. But there was also Babylonia, and they took over like a lot of land. They took over a lot. That Babylonian Empire was fucking massive, and they actually snagged up some people from Israel, or what is now Israel. And those people, even though they were swooped up by Babylon, they were able to preserve their language, and they were also able to preserve their alphabet. And they began writing in Biblical Hebrew around 1200 BCE. And from 1200 BCE all the way to 100 BCE, they started working on scripture. So it was a long period of time that they wrote. But during this period, and the development of this alphabet, there's the conversation about how God is depicted both in language, like in the scripture, and then also in art. And it is constantly referred to as like the hand of God, or the fingers of God. And the fingers or the hand of God would commune by making impressions on stone tablets. So for example, Moses got the 10 Commandments effectively written by God. Fuck is happening? Hold on. I just got a weather alert that just popped up on my screen. Hold on. That was so weird. I got a weather alert and it just showed fire. It like popped up on my screen. It was just like this. It was like 60 degrees. Fire.
When Mogwin is in your area. But Skelly's asks, hey, where's our dinosaurs from, Soft? Come on, you gave us millennia of history, but no dinosaurs? My man's literally forgot about the ancient dragons and their butts. Somebody said something. All right. Killer King, thanks for dropping by the chat. You'll catch the VOD later. Appreciate that. And yeah, you take care. You have a good night. And we will be going live again tomorrow. You assume the dragons are typically the dinosaurs? Yeah.
What's happening? Okay, so anyway, there's the hand of God, and yeah, it's pretty common for the fingers of God to leave impressions on shit, and typically that is like the language of God or God's new law or decree. And it's really cool because good old Elden John, who we know and love, somebody actually described him as like, oh, when I first saw him, I thought of Moses holding the Ten Commandments. That's actually closer of a guess than you might think, because the tarnished archaeologist actually pointed out that the tablet that's at his foot is the map of Babylon. So that actually makes...
I actually heard about this theory before TA released their video from Sophie Pilbeam, so I feel a little sad that it seems like some of her thunder got stolen, unfortunately. But yeah, the Moses thing and the map of Babylon or Mesopotamia is just... I do think that one is probably one of the more deliberate assets that got included into the game. And I don't really have a super good reason for it, other than just like they seem a lot more deliberately placed than like the obelisks and stuff. And because the obelisks don't really match each other super well, it does seem to me that they were placed less intentionally. Oh yeah, and then More Lore asked, and oh, welcome back to the stream, do you think the Elden Beast made the fingers or the Greater Will directly? I think the Elden Beast, being the vassal beast of the Greater Will, means it's subservient and then therefore secondary to the Greater Will. And as for the fingers, I'm a little bit on the fence in that they could have been created by the Greater Will, and I'd be fine with that being a full-on fact. But I also think they could be a kind of cosmic middleman trying to tell the Tarnished what they want the envisionment of order to be, and they might not actually represent the Greater Will directly, and we don't really know if they truly do commune with the Greater Will. And even if they do commune with the Greater Will, do they fully understand the Greater Will if they don't fully understand what's going on in the lands between? There's a lot of questions about the knowledge of the fingers.
Makes sense, because during the period that Babylon had, some Israelites and they're writing their scripture is around the time that they were writing about Moses, possibly. There's a lot going on there. And there's also another little tricky thing with language. Moses was also accredited to be a really famous alchemist, like a really famous ancient alchemist. And I think he got conflated with Moses the prophet. So there's a lot going on there. A lot of people like to see this man as kind of like, maybe he's like the early dynast, maybe he's a prophet, whatever. I definitely see him as more of a prophet figure because of the era that he falls in regards to like the tablet and other stuff. I also want to point out too, Zeostorm actually made a post about this on Twitter earlier, but go watch Zeostorm's videos. But even though this is referring to the hand of God and the fingerprints and the impressions of God, the inspiration for that pattern actually comes from an ancient tomb in France that is like a big monolith, but it doesn't have to do with the fingerprints of God at all. So this is the one instance in which I feel like they use artistic inspiration to give a sense of like time. So the reason why they chose...
I think that's a very interesting thing that I actually didn't know about. And as she said, it might represent time. That's kind of a cool thought, but it's kind of hard to say that for sure. And as she said, it might have just been like an artistic influence. And tying this pattern to fingerprints specifically, I think is just really creative, even though it's kind of a secondhand plagiarism, if that makes sense.
This tomb to be representative of the three fingers specifically is because this tomb is like fucking ancient. This tomb is like in France around the same time that the Sumerians are posted up. The tomb kind of lands around this area, like maybe 3500 BCE. So it's at the dawn of man, but it's just in a different locale, and it's not through an alphabetical language. It's through like a very like fluid, I think that there is something that Miyazaki is saying here with this distinction between cultures that have a written language and this distinction between cultures that use shapes, motion, and nature to communicate. Another really important thing that I want to, like a little tangent that I want to go off of in regard to this, is that even in Scandinavian art, there was a lot of spirituality expressed through symmetry and through motion and through nature. There's a lot of patterns in nature that tend to like repeat themselves, and whether that's like the passage of time, like the seasons repeating themselves, people getting older, dying, being reborn. There's a lot that ancient people were able to infer about the natural order of like the world that is represented in their art, that's represented in like their early literature, and starts to show up in their belief systems. And
yeah, I think that's a very true statement there, as opposed to like a lesser true statement. I don't know, but anyway, yeah, to build off that, things like the numerology really took off with kind of noticing those patterns. Like the one thing that obviously pops into my head with that would be the golden ratio and like the Pythagorean theorem of like right triangles being based on like the principle of 3, 4, and 5. So Fibonacci sequence, all that stuff kind of ties into that, as well as like the idea of a mandala, which correlates super well with the shapes that we find on the Scandinavian pieces of bronze work, apparently, and the fire giants thing. So I feel like that's a pretty solid connection there. But Spaghetti had said something in the chat that I wanted to address, that it's all captivating, but you're reminded of my comment the other night on how a lot of visual stuff kind of ends up being more like Rorschach, or like more thematic stuff is like a Rorschach ink blot where people will kind of see what they see out of the shapes, which is definitely true. But to be fair to Quelaag here, I don't actually think she's trying to come from a certain position and influence other people's thoughts as much as she's trying to see if there are actually any tangible connections with the art used in history versus the art used in Elden Ring. So I do respect her approach here, because I haven't seen her making like any like Rorschach style claims, other than, you know, thinking that some of these bits of artwork can be more correlated to time, which I think is a pretty fair comment to make in regard to Elden Ring, because it's just kind of a natural process of taking one thing from another culture and it's time to represent something in the game. So like the one thing that Tarnished Archaeologist had brought up in one of their videos about like gold working and the statues, or not statues, but the sarcophagi in Fair Missoula more or less being an exact replica of a man who had like a bunch of gold on his body, in like the beginnings of like gold working in the world. And except the biggest difference is like FromSoft took the artistic liberty of depicting the skeleton of that man as a beast man in Elden Ring. So I do think you can make those kinds of parallels fairly comfortably for the most part. And Ava says, something that these assets tell you is that the lands between have history upon history that goes even beyond the giants and the Crucible. Yeah, and that's something that I felt for a long time, especially when you consider like the old and old dynasties and the Sun Realm more specifically. I do think the Sun Realm probably comfortably predates the rise of Godfrey and Marika's age. Yeah, and as Chadwick says, they probably took specific real-world cultural elements evocative of various religious systems over time. Yeah, she's getting the data out there, gotta respect it. That's how I feel. Yeah, it's not just theory crafting stuff. Okay. Do I think the Shadowhound or Shadowbound beasts used to be beastmen? No, I think they're probably demi-humans, because Malekith, if you see the very cursed image of Malekith without his fur and his armor, he looks ridiculously similar to a demi-human queen. Blythe obviously looks a little bit different, but I think the principle is still probably meant to be the same.
You'll love to see it because it also pops up in Elden Ring as well. So, woo! Great. Beautiful, spicy. Love it. So now let's take a brief break from Mesopotamia. We're stopping right here. Or I guess, no, let's keep talking about Moses. Let's keep talking about the tablets and stuff. So, in addition to the Tarnished Archaeologists mentioning that it's the map of Babel, something that's super important about this map is that it's actually the introduction to trigonometry. Scientists discovered that the purpose of this clay tablet was that it is the world's oldest and most accurate trigonometric table, possibly used by ancient mathematical scribes to calculate how to construct palaces and temples and how to build canals. The new research shows that the Babylonians beat the Greeks to the invention of trigonometry and the study of triangles by more than 1,000 years. We start to see really complex math and architecture forming. The Palace of Ould, in addition to being inspired by the Sumerians, the Scandinavian cultures, and the people that are in the Mediterranean, it's also got some other influences too. We have Jordan.
So yeah, I definitely didn't know that stuff about ancient Sumeria and their relation to trigonometry. That's really interesting. And the fact that it's over 1,000 years before the Greeks is just kind of mind-blowing to me. I mean, on some sense, it kind of makes sense because triangles are triangles, but certainly the math of trigonometry is a lot more advanced than just the very reductive comment of, hey guys, triangles are triangles. You know? But anyway, Bella, welcome back to the stream. Nice to have you. Who said it? You said demi-human was the last thing you expected me to say, and then Bella said, you never thought of any possible connection between Malekith and the demi-humans. Yeah, so the way that I look at demi-humans with the Two Fingers' ability to gull demi-humans as well as like regular humans, I think that probably ties into the fact that the Two Fingers control shadows and light to a degree, and would tie into the whole idea of Malekith being a demi-human and Blythe being demi-humans and their relations to shadows in general. They also had a fundamentally different way to calculate trig back then, as you recall. Makes sense. You don't care if any of it is relevant to the lore? Art and history, yum. Triangles and triangles reminds you of the meme of Newton saying, hey, things that aren't moving probably won't move if you don't move them. And people's minds being blown. Yeah.
The architecture in Jordan that is influencing the Palace of Ould and the Ould Labyrinth ruins. Any of this stuff shows that this architecture predates the Nox Eternal Cities. And a huge reason why I say that is because the Nox Eternal Cities are actually very distinguished Gothic architecture. And I'm gonna get into the Goths as they're like a nomadic group that end up taking over the Roman Empire. Or taking over what was the Roman Empire was already in decline. They end up taking it over, and then their civilization then starts creating Gothic style architecture, which is inspired by Germanic and Scandinavian stuffs, because they kind of occupied that area. But you can see that there's a very clear technological difference between this, very detailed, there's buttresses. Buttresses are, you can't, there's actually no, I can't really see. I guess this is just a slanted roof. If I can find a buttress, I'll show you. But Gothic architecture typically has, on the outside, buttresses and spires. Here's a spire. There's lots of columns and shit.
Isn't this little bridge kind of here? Doesn't that have buttresses? I don't know. I wish I knew more about architecture a little bit.
But on the inside, they have vaulted ceilings, which are these diamond patterned, but they're also arched. It's the same shit. There's also lots of cool cathedral-y type stained glass shit. And you can actually go up into the eternal city of Noxtella near one of the big thrones. There's a big cathedral room that the throne's sitting in. So this is very modern. This is super modern. This is we're not even in the BCE anymore. We're in the Common Era now, and we are 1000 to 1200 CE at this point. So this is super modern. The Eternal Cities is very advanced. So that's why I'm saying all this architecture and the language and the alphabets that they use predates a lot of shit. Predates Marika, predates, whatever. Something.
So Chadwick said the buttresses are like the arches that hold up the skinny towers on Dracula's castle. Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. Hopefully.
Also, what's really interesting about the Palace of Wold is that it spans all the way from Liurnia to Caelid. If you actually take a look at how far the ruins span between the labyrinth that's on the top side of Liurnia and all the Ironcell and the Shiofra river wells, you can see any of the ancient obelisks and any of the old style architecture like this. It's like the entire lands between. It's literally like the biggest landmass. It's not as divided and it's not small.
I wonder if she goes into any detail about like the gigantic pillars that are their buttresses that like are built into the edges of the continents. Like in the southern portion of Limgrave, you can like jump from them into Weeping Peninsula. On the eastern side of Caelid, whereas like next to the Radahn's arena with the terrible magic golem that has no reason to exist there. They're even in the mountaintops of the giants at the like next to the graveyard where you can find Goldmask and Corrin, like those things. Because I would like to know more about them. Because in a certain sense, they don't seem as though they'd be older than the old architecture, but from the perspective of Elden Ring itself, like the actual in-game archaeology, or if you want to call it that, whatever you want to call it, they seem like they should predate most everything and potentially be related to the giants. I don't know. The big giants and chairs, you believe the Nox attempted to make artificial fire giants because giant flame stuff and yada yada? Just a hypothesis? Thoughts? I don't know about that because at the very least, if they're like meant to be artificial fire giants, it's kind of weird that they put them in a position of veneration with their giant crypts. It's also really weird that there's only ever like one of them in Nokron and like Noxtella and Celia. So they're just very strange because they do have like the Nox symbols on their robes, but they also don't seem to have an extra face in their chest, which, I mean, trolls don't either, but you could make the argument that the trolls had their faces cut out of them, and that's why they're all like hollow-bodied, but who really knows? Okay. Going back to the video. I'm trying to remember if she said anything. Oh no, I was just thinking of like the old stuff and like the big column things.
Compared to all the other civilizations that we know in more modern Elden Ring history time. But something really cool is that there's this story about the Tower of Babel that has fallen to pieces, and it is a story about a group of people, a society, a civilization, and they all speak one language, and they're all unified, and through their unification they're able to build a tower that is able to take them up to God. And it kind of is that cautionary tale of feeling like humans.
Alright, so that looked like a little bit of an OBS fail there. I think I'm back now. So I'm going to back up the video like 10 seconds or so, and then we should be good.
From building.
No, I didn't get muted. I got like disconnected. OBS problem. Alright, going back.
Building upwards towards the sky and instead building outwards. A little bit of a cautionary tale about God, but also a tale about city planning and I guess not building towers, but we do that now anyway, so sucks to suck. God? we're gonna build skyscrapers, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what I was trying to say with that. Anyways.
All right, so Ava said, the big thing that you love about Quelaag's videos is how she mainly uses Miro and keeps things minimal, because sometimes some of the more popular lore videos can be overstimulating. Yeah, I get that. It's kind of a balancing act, because this is... I don't want to say like it's a mess to look at, because it's actually like very organized extremely well, but it doesn't necessarily lead the eye into like a certain state of flow to like look at it, to just kind of like draw people in, other than like, ooh, piece of candy, ooh, piece of candy, ooh, piece of candy. And YouTube is kind of like primarily like an entertainment platform rather than like an informational one, which is a little bit, you know, both obvious and kind of ironic at the same time, because we're doing some sort of like weird meta informational sharing type thing with like these streams and my channel in general, and yet also trying to entertain with that. I don't know. Anyway, so while these can pack like a lot of information in a more like bite-sized fashion, it's harder to keep people engrossed because everybody's attention spans have just been like deteriorated with the internet in general. So it's really hard to compete with literally every other piece of human art and history available at one's fingertips. So showmanship is really important to like grow an audience, and so it's really difficult to try to like balance very nuanced topics like this, and also like condensing it and streamlining it in such a way that's appeals to a very wide audience, to like keep on boosting those numbers, because it does take a ton of effort to release stuff like this, which is how it broke Quelaag, which I can totally relate to. And it sucks if you go through all that effort and it just kind of goes out there into the ether and just echoes back very faintly. I don't know. So yeah, I do appreciate these videos. It's just very difficult trying to balance building a channel that encourages new people to like stick around or like look at what's going on. So, like I said, tons of information, maybe not the best like starting point for somebody to get into Elden Ring lore, but yeah, it's just a balancing act, as I keep repeating myself. Rabble said you stopped watching Vati because you feel his vids are too deep into the showmanship end now. Yeah, that's a kind of common criticism. That's kind of how I felt about Vati for a long time. I haven't watched his videos in an extremely long time. Like, nothing against him. It's just not the style of presentation that appeals to me, especially because he tends to use a little bit more authoritative tone of voice than I prefer when things I feel are a bit more open-ended at times. Yeah, I understood you weren't complaining about her presentation. I'm just saying, like, some people think that this is, like, less polished, which is kind of understandable, I guess. There's an art to make information broad enough to appeal but not be reductive. Yeah, it's so difficult. Like, it took me 3 months, or it took me like 2 months of scripting out my gold and silver video, and then like the extra month producing it with like getting all of the footage that I needed, which, I mean, I also had like a ton of footage to begin with, but just when you're making a video of that length and trying to like have it be like super presentable, it takes a lot more of extra footage than you ever think you need, just to like show off things in as much detail that you want. And so the hardest part of writing is condensing things and editing, and same thing with like video editing, just making it condensed and legible, yet also not reductive or skipping over too many things. So I feel like my videos tend to be a little bit busy, but that's also because I have the unfortunate task of trying to compare multiple languages, and also I don't try to like spoon feed all of the lore to like people. I just try to show what's relevant. And sometimes I feel like the easiest way to like justify my claims are just to quickly throw up what I'm referencing and read the relevant bits. So yeah, it's something that I feel like I struggle with as well. So sorry to get too off in the details of something unrelated to this, but yeah.
So in the Mediterranean, this is actually something I messed up on my first video. I was talking about Minoan cultures that lived on the island of Crete. However, I got it conflated with the Mycenaeans because eventually the Mycenaeans do take over the island of Crete and the rest of South Greece, what is now Greece. But the Mycenaeans are super interesting because they have a citadel, a big palace that's here. And the Minonians, is what I wanted to say, have the Palace of Knossos, which the Palace of Knossos is actually supposed to be the labyrinth that the Minotaur wanders in, like in mythology. But it's actually just like a normal palace, and it's a little bit sprawly and labyrinthian, but it's not like the most confusing thing ever. But there's this myth about I was gonna say it's a little bit ironic that she said it's kind of labyrinthian when the whole thing with like the Minotaur it's like located next to the labyrinth, where we get the term labyrinth from. Oh, a labyrinth of Crete. It's right here. Okay. Like half human, half cow that wanders the labyrinth and all this other stuff. But it's really cool because we have the ancestral followers who hang out in the old palace labyrinth on the top side of Liurnia. And they're really interesting because the ancestral followers actually abstain from the use of language and metalworking. So, do they abstain language? I don't remember that in the description. I'll probably like try to pull it up on the side here. I just remember them abstaining from using metallurgy. But she also said that off the cuff, so I'm like not really gonna hold her too strongly to that, because this is very obviously not scripted. So much of this stuff is throwbacks to intro art history, the nostalgia. What do I think of Hawkshaw's ancestral follower video? I haven't watched it. Like, the whole, hey, Mad Luigi, nice to see you again. As to what Morlor was just saying, since you're newer to the stream, the way that I've been going through Elden Ring lore, I've kind of been very cloistered away from the community at large. And I figured it'd be kind of fun to learn more about others' experiences and their perspectives and share like my process going through this. So if you want me to watch that, go ahead and link it in the actual comments, because chat will delete it apparently, and or the Discord. Yeah, you're on the Discord now. So if you put it in the channel feedback tab, I'll add it to the list, and then you can get my thoughts directly there. So you guys are saying, to be fair to Vati, prioritizing storytelling over the fact of the story is directly what Miyazaki wants to encourage and why he deliberately pulls details. I would disagree. I think it's a bit nuanced. Like, Miyazaki wants people to connect to the story, but I don't necessarily know that he wants it to be told to them from another lens, which is, I think, probably why he doesn't want to be that lens himself. So I think he probably wants people to have like more personal connections to it, which I mean is kind of ironic that I'm telling you, hey guys, don't listen to others for lore, when, you know, that's kind of what I'm doing right now. But I mean, that is something that I do stress quite a bit, to just kind of always have that healthy amount of skepticism when interacting with channels like mine or Vati's or stuff like that. Vati's put out a pretty decent amount of Elden Ring content. It's just Smotown's putting out hour-long videos almost weekly. Yeah, I have no idea how he keeps such a pace going. My man's is a machine. Language and metalworking are actually super important in human history. Obviously, it's like the birth of our ability to create technology and tools and language and the alphabet and share ideas and share gods and share spirituality and da 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 da. But they abstain from that, and through that they're able to become ancestral spirits that then become trees. So they nourish the spiritual aspect of their souls, but they don't necessarily nurture the fire of ambition. Okay, Luigi said they eschew letters. Okay, I didn't understand
what you were saying out of context. So the ancestral followers issue letters. Okay, I get that. So I would say they don't necessarily don't use language. They just don't use written language. But yeah. But I guess they don't really speak too much anymore now, do they? They do have their like goofy little chanting, but I digress.
I talked before about blue and red in a previous video that is now unlisted because I want to redo that video, but I do think that nourishing the soul results in the blue ancestral spirit, whereas nourishing the body and language and humanity and the fire of ambition results in like the blood or the magma or the fire of humanity. I'll talk about it again another time, but it's cool that there's this reference to the Minoan people, the labyrinth, the palace of Knossos, and all that other stuff. But over time, they do get occupied by, and they lose their independence by the Mycenaeans in the 1600s. I guess this one says the 1400s, so my bad. But yeah, so Mycenaeans build this really cool citadel, and the citadel has these two lions that protect the gate. We see Siraj kind of as like an image quite a bit, as like this protector.
I feel like I've actually seen this in Elden Ring. Is this... No, these look like they're both real. I'm trying to think if this is in Fair Missoula or maybe on some other crumbling ruin somewhere. Like, I feel like I have seen this. It's going to bother me. And I'm not talking about this one either. I think something more along these lines.
Or this being that keeps Godfrey in check, but also is like the symbol of the Round Table Hold. Mycenaean culture and lions, it's like pretty distinguishable, pretty important, pretty iconic. We also see it down in the Undercities in the Wool Palace ruins with the two lions facing each other. But in this image, it's actually quite interesting. It looks like they might be... I don't want to say stabbing a bird. I don't want to say stabbing a bird because y'all know how I feel about the twin birds and like birds and Elden Ring in general. But this is very weird. This whole image is very weird to me, and I feel like there's more to it. I feel like there's a little secret. But we have what looks like the primordial current, maybe a lotus blossom, maybe a bloom, the bloom of a flower. And then like this pole that the lions are holding onto as they stab into the earth. So I don't know what the fuck that's supposed to mean. But hey, we're here, Mycenaean culture. So there's like this era right after the Mycenaean downfall where there's like dark ages. Like there's a lot of reasons as to why this could have happened. Archaeologists agree that it might be multiple things, but it for the most part is a mystery. It's probably like multiple environmental impacts all happening at the same time. But there's the Dark Ages where a lot of populations declined dramatically, major cities ceased to exist, and the literacy disappeared for the next 300 years. That's so long without written language and without the communication of ideals and spirituality and like storytelling. Obviously there is oral myth and oral storytelling, but we're missing a lot of the written accounts of things. Whereas the Sumerians were actually very meticulous, almost like accountants. They always kept information about like how much cattle they had and whatever the fuck, you know? But
yeah, I think one of the earliest forms of writing ever found was a receipt of cattle being transported across a Sumerian river or something like that from like a ferry, maybe? Ferry spelled F-E-R-R-Y, not F-A-I-R-Y, for what it's worth. Considering we have like ferries and rivers related to fairies in Elden Ring, but yeah. Ool tools follow historical rule. Yeah, that's kind of how I felt, and so this kind of helps justify in my mind thinking that the Ool dynasty is probably older than most other forms of civilizations in Elden Ring. And although she didn't talk about it here, I do think there is the potential, and you know, this is speculation. Why do I keep confusing those two words recently? I do think there is the potential that the ancestral worshippers could be remnants of the original Ool dynasty. Not like not original remnants, just like the civilizations remnants, if that makes sense. You really like how Cyclops are just something people came up with because people saw mammoth and elephant skulls? It kind of makes sense if you just had no idea what the hell a mammoth or an elephant was. But yeah, I do think it's really funny as well.
A lot was lost during the Greek Dark Ages, and there became little myths about forms of architecture and other stuff. One of the myths is that the Mycenaean architecture was actually built by cyclopses, by giants who were like fucking massive and had the strength to pick up massive rocks. And that's where they believed a lot of this architecture came from, and it's actually called Cyclopes architecture. Yeah, so it's any architecture that has massive mounds of disorganized, kind of uneven stones that looked like a giant would have picked up. It's not across all cultures, specifically like in the Greek areas. But obviously giants are like, you know, there's giants in all cultures. What the fuck is my cursor doing? Whatever, we in it now. We have a scrolly wheel now. Obviously there's giants in Scandinavian and Nordic cultures, with the fire giants and the frost giants, the creation of the world, but we also have our cyclopses, and we have all that other stuff, and they all get kind of overlapped into the fire giants. The fire giant is both a fire giant from Nordic and Scandinavian mythology, but he's also a cyclops. He has a singular eye in the center of his body, and across all these different cultures, cyclopses and giants tend to be very slow, very dumb, but are also incredible architects, smiths, metal workers, blacksmiths, whatever. And we see that again in Elden Ring, although not all of them are lumbering and dumb. E.G. is like a war counselor, so it's pretty cool to see the neat different ways that they're all depicted.
To be fair, E.G. is kind of a dumbass and forgets that the literal stars govern his mistress's fate. Nah, but in all seriousness, tinfoil's bad, okay? I don't know. We never see anyone mention Der Rheingold here. You think it would come up? I have no idea what that is, Chadwick. You love how Quelaag has a dancing alien in almost every video? So the Fell God has the big eye, the Greater Will has frenzy fingers. The Greater Will and Frenzy has fingers. What body parts would the other out of gods have? Noses, tongues, mouths, trunks, to make a tree-based pun.
It's cool. I love it. And then also I want to talk a little bit about the Bronze Age. There's some other stuff going on here too.
Fudge, I was muted. Okay, so I was gonna say, Chadwick did say that, what's his face? Der Rheingold was an opera about a golden ring, giants, Valkyries, and maybe the basis for Lord of the Rings. And then I asked while I was muted whether or not that's just like Norse mythology in general. I don't know that opera specifically, obviously, but I do know that those all show up in the mythos of the Norse. You don't like the idea of a tongue-based outer god at all? It's Abaddon. What's my opinion on the E.G. murder? Mystery, Black Knife, Godskin, Black Flame? Just absolute mess of a situation. As dissatisfying as it may be, I do think it's a bit more of a dev mistake. We talked about this a couple nights ago, I think it was, that we don't really have a satisfactory answer of why his dead flames aren't red, because he should have been killed by Black Knife assassins who would have used Destined Death and all that. So did a random Godskin apostle or noble just walk up on the scene after the fact and like try to cremate him? I doubt it. So For what it's worth, in previous iterations of the Erd Tree burning, we have dialogue from Aeneas saying that it was death, that it was the black flames of death or something like that. Actually, I do have the audio isolated. Let me pull this up for you guys and entreat you to something a little bit random and all that. All right, so I've got 2 different clips of it, apparently.
Black flames have
Sorry if that's extremely loud. It's extremely loud for me. Let me check how it looks on the thing.
devoured the Erd Tree.
Okay, yeah, that's extremely loud. I'll do this, and I'll restart it.
Black flames have devoured the Erd Tree, and the lands between are shrouded by death's dark fate.
So that was number 1, and now here's number 2, which is exactly the same, pretty much.
Black flames have devoured the Erd Tree, and the lands between are shrouded by death's dark fate.
Okay, so for what it's worth, Black Flame was originally more associated with like the Rune of Death, because obviously that's her dialogue in the cutscene when we touch the Rune of Death after defeating Malekith. So, just to reiterate, I think it's unfortunate, but the EG stuff is probably like a dev mistake. Okay. Okay, so the opera could be a combo of those folk beliefs. Okay. Thanks for that info, by the way. I'll probably look into that if I ever remember. It does strike you as odd they didn't change it, though. Yeah, so I've seen like a lot of comments over the release of the game where like people are like, oh, look, they haven't changed Great Tree. That must mean that like it's canon. They wouldn't like leave these mistakes in the game. But if those kind of comments were true and had more weight, then the notes in Bloodborne would have been fixed a long, long time ago. Unfortunately, after they kind of complete a project, they don't really touch it up too much, and they've actually touched up Elden Ring a lot more than I would have expected with fixing like the Dusk-Eyed Queen and Gloam-Eyed Queen in patch 1.05, if I remember correctly. So yeah. Going back to Quelaag's video so far with the Bronze Age.
We got Boar Era art. For those of you unfamiliar, it's Borre. They have like buggy-eyed animals, and it freaks me the fuck out. I don't like it. But we also see
a little bit of inside that actually kind of reminds me of Uria's like build mask from Dark Souls 3. Obviously, it's extremely different, but just like the shape of it.
Eyed animals, and it freaks me the fuck out. I don't like it. But we also see some Scandinavian metalworking and some buggy eye crows in the branch sword. But this is the most confusing item to me because the Vikings and people in Japan never really met before. There's not a lot of historic evidence that they ever crossed paths. However, this branch sword is really similar to ones found in Japan, like a ceremonial sword, where as the knotwork and a lot of the finer details in this are very Scandinavian. So, kind of confusing. Have a lot of twin birds during this time because
I think that's fair, but you could also make the argument that this branch sword could symbolize flame, and obviously it might have like the more historic Japanese connections, which might be relevant, but I don't think they're really meant to. I think this is just kind of like artistic license, kind of similarly to how those the fingerprint shield is kind of based off of those French tablets that aren't necessarily related to the fingerprints of God and whatnot.
So, kind of confusing. Have a lot of twin birds during this time because Odin had 2 birds that acted as his eyes. It reminds me of the 2 cuckoo, although I feel like the 2 cuckoo are also representative of alchemical symbolism, which I'll get to. We're getting there. So, I kind of mentioned before about the 2 fingers and all that other stuff. Eventually, like, emperors and rulers get around the whole like, well, we're not going to depict our gods visually, so we're just going to depict our gods crowning us visually. So then that way we're still like the authority figure in this situation. Here's a little hand putting a crown on. I think this is Constantine. Maybe it's somebody else. But yeah, there's a lot of that. You see a lot of that in Rome, and you see a lot of that in certain medieval civilizations of like a hand coming down from the clouds putting a crown on somebody's head, and therefore they're the new divine law. But ooh, I'm gonna knock some shit over. We also, with the fire of creation, we see a lot of these amazing like things happen. We see human rights being discussed. We see law and language and people's fair share. We see accounting. We see, you know, myths and storytelling. We see a lot of these really wonderful creative innovations and stories. But we also start seeing instances in which fire and technology are used for like mass destruction. And I think that goes into the symbolism of fire being all-consuming and dangerous. It's like a creative and nourishing force. It cooks our food and it does all this, you know, amazing stuff for us, but at the same time it's also embodies like so much more. And there was actually Greek fire in 1672 CE, where the Greeks would actually put a bellow along with some pumps and oil and a I think it's a bronze nozzle, and a match or a lamp, and it would effectively create a moving flamethrower. Typically they were placed on the front of ships and they could set ships on fire. In this iteration of it, it looks like they put it on a little chariot, and I double checked like the wheels and some of this stuff, and it definitely looks like a trebuchet a little bit, but they have the little bellow right here. You could actually get really close and see like all the little mechanics of it. And it's almost really interesting. The fire giant almost looks like it's wearing like a crown of thorns. So there's a lot of interesting symbolism happening here with the fire giants, and maybe sin, punishment, destructive fire. You know, like the story of Ragnarok talks about like a fire that's going to destroy the tree in the age of the gods and stuff. In Elden Ring, it's like it's mankind's fire, or it's the giant's fire that's going to destroy the age of the gods. But the giants seem to be like more like passive people in this.
Yeah, that's as high as I can make it right now, Foster. I did turn it up slightly since I saw your message, but it was only 2 decibels, so it's probably not very effective, unfortunately. Her videos are a little bit on the quiet side for me in general.
It almost seems like that prophecy was... The prophecy ends up being self-fulfilling because we end up fucking it all up anyway, but the giants seem to be just chilling, and then Mariko was like, I'm scared of this prophecy, fuck you. And then the fire giants were like, okay, I guess. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that happens that I can't keep up with, and this is kind of the part of the video where I get really sad, because there is so much in Asia that is represented. Some of the first fire and cannons were in the 12th century, or what am I saying? 1200 BC? I'm pretty sure. There's a lot of really amazing stuff that's happening in Asia at this time. We also have the nomadic falconers and the wandering traders who travel the equivalent of the Silk Road in the 900 CE. This dude has this instrument that was created around 960 CE. Sorry, my brain is like flatlining at this point. They also would use their falcons to help them hunt, but in Elden Ring, Sekiro Dubi realized that they actually utilized the falcons to send messages to each other, and this runic alphabet right here, I believe, is the same runic alphabet that those like content creators deciphered and found out that it was a long lost dialect from the Yi tribe, I believe. So really interesting stuff. this.
Yeah, I think that's cool, but that's like one of those things where I feel like even if you know that, I'm not so sure how much that informs like the lore of the game. Not just like laugh at her or anything like that. It's just it'd be, even if we deciphered it, I don't really think this is meant to be decipherable, but I don't know if that has too much of a bearing on what the characters, like what language they used, because at the very least this is a little bit different from the two finger stuff, so maybe you can make the argument that like the language evolved more out of time over time, or maybe this stuff isn't like religious based text. I don't know. Yeah, I'm curious about the timing of that, but in general I'm a little bit surprised she hasn't like tried to connect more of this stuff in with specific periods with Godfrey and like Radigan. I mean, there's a little bit of it here, but I mean, obviously that's not necessarily the focus of her video, and maybe that would help give her some of that focus by connecting the times to certain things. So obviously the Celtic knot kind of inspiring the more modern / ancient Erd tree symbol could be a thing, but yeah, this is very ancient in general, but when we get into like the Radigan stuff being more related to Christianity in comparison to like the more Greek and Mesopotamian stuff, that makes more sense that this would be kind of like later in the Elden Ring timeline and maybe the historical one. I don't know, but that's also why I keep a little bit of distance between like really myself and really falling down this rabbit hole of art history and the lore. Okay, good to know that, Foster.
Line of blue sticky notes that says Christianization was kind of like the spread of Christianity across all cultures. Historically, this is like where that is in the timeline, which is a point of history. It's a point of history. And then we start to get kind of like Enlightenment period, but also early alchemy in the 1500s, and SMB on youtube.com mentioned that the 1600s is when the earliest telescopes were built. So it's really interesting because the Academy of Raya Lucaria is actually one of the more advanced buildings in the game. I would say Volcano Manor is pretty advanced as well. It's because it's a manor. It's not like a big cathedral castle building. It's a little bit more it's a bit, I don't know, it's a little fancy, but it's got rooms like an actual estate, or like a manor, not like a church or like an academy. I don't know.
Stella says alchemy is way earlier than the 1500s. I think she's talking about like a specific form of it. And then Rabs Rabble said, there's just a lot of cool world building details, even if you don't want to apply it to anything. Yeah, and that's kind of what I think she's like struggling with right now. She might be trying to see if there's a more of a pattern, which I totally respect the effort, but this is also why I didn't put in that effort.
I don't know how to describe it. It seems more modern. We were talking about it. He was asking me when I thought the buildings were made, and I would say probably Byzantine, because chandeliers weren't a thing until like the Byzantine era. There's hella chandeliers in Volcano Manor. There's also hella chandeliers in Raya Lucaria. Fuck. I don't know. Those buildings are very modern, very new, fun and fresh, funky fresh. But around this time, alchemists were using code because they didn't want other alchemists to steal their codes, their work. But there was also pressure from the church to not engage in alchemy because there was this idea that whoever had the Philosopher's Stone or whoever had like these, really important alchemical findings controlled everything. Like you can control the market, you can create gold out of nothing, you can...
Yeah, so alchemy was kind of associated with like Satanism back then, and there's a lot of esoteric knowledge that kind of lended people to believe that stuff because, depending on certain chemical reactions, you could literally make explosions and stuff like that. But I mean, regardless of that kind of side of it, there's the more geometric stuff. So like, I don't want to say like where's my mouse? I don't want to say like this design of like this blue thing right here is exactly what I'm trying to like reference, but the idea of how I was going to try to like zoom in like a real Miro board, of certain bits of alchemy or certain bits of elements and matter being related to shapes, and the relation of that of like the different shapes and combining them and reconstituting them, repurposing them, is sort of like the idea of messing with the seals to hell, sort of. But I mean, that's, like that, the way that I phrase that makes it sound like more matter of fact, but it's not quite that simple. Like, don't just take me at my word, because I'm kind of talking out of my ass here. But the reason why I'm trying to get at this stuff is, like, if you look at plays, like, I think Faustus was originally written in the 1600s, and it talks about, like, the kinds of natural sciences that Faust would perform along with, like, his devil worshipping, in a sense. And so for those who don't know, like, in this play, Faust made a deal with the devil made a deal with Satan, Lucifer, to gain the devil Mephistopheles as a servant for a specific period of time. And so he wanted to take that devil and create a kind of world based off of, I don't want to say like based off of science, but he wanted to like increase the station of man to make a heaven on earth using the powers of the devil. So it's a little bit nuanced, I guess. Yeah. So, okay.
You can do all this really amazing stuff, but it also gave you a lot of creative power. And there was, I was talking to somebody in the comments about this. There was actually a pope who outlawed certain alchemy practices.
Yeah, so what I was trying to say with the Faust stuff is, like, alchemy being related to creation infringes on the realm of God. So that's why it was disdained by many people. And of course, like, attitudes changed. They weren't always, like, consistent. So take that with a grain of salt there. She might mean, like, post-Renaissance alchemy, like more like the Philosopher's Stone type alchemy, when people are starting to actually know more about the elements. But I don't know exactly what her frame of reference is for making that claim. It might be because of, like, other scientific advancements related to this era, as well as, like, architectural stuff in relation to, like, the Knox buildings and their design, and, like, this brand of alchemy, perhaps.
Because there was this threat between, like, the church and, like, creation, and how alchemy just kind of was in conflict with man being kind of like God. There's all those stories about flying too close to the sun and building the Tower of Babel and blah, 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 being too close to God, that I think the church feared. But there was also a lot of, like, health risks at this time, too. Alchemy was also outlawed because if you did something wrong, you could potentially, like, poison gas yourself. It just was not the safest practice ever. But yeah, so there's a multitude of reasons as to why people kept that shit secret.
So Matt Luigi asks a really good question in that, do I think this kind of deep analysis tries to fit the game world into an understanding that the devs themselves likely didn't worry about as much, like when designing game areas and placing chandeliers? Or is that not giving FromSoft enough credit in terms of being meticulous crafters? I think it's a little bit of both, because they do want to pay attention to details, but it's that some things are kind of taken for granted. So in the cosmology of Elden Ring, and I guess we should preface by saying, like, the lands between aren't Earth, so, like, the invention of certain things can differ, and you can make all those kinds of fun claims about a fantastic world that has literally magic that governs things and acts as a metaphysical force that's observable to a degree and studyable, which is kind of super cool. But anyway, just the idea that telescopes weren't invented until about, like, 1600 in the real world might not be analogous to Elden Ring, because astrologers are for all intents and purposes, really ancient by these standards. But to be fair, those astrologers may not have used telescopes themselves, and so the telescope really still could be a later invention that just still kind of works out in FromSoft's favor when the Karian astrology was withering on the vine and the end of the Age of Plenty was nigh and beginning to transition into the Age of Radigan. So the thing with chandeliers, they might have used some of that intentionally. Like, obviously the Nox architecture is more modern, but they might have overlooked the potential issues of having Nox architecture be more modern in comparison to places like Celia, Ordina, and or Lanedell itself. So that isn't to say that there aren't like chandeliers in Lanedell, but it depends on whether or not FromSoft intended the Nox banishment to be earlier than the establishment of Lanedell or to be later than the establishment of Lanedell. Because if it came later, that makes sense, but it's just a little bit unintuitive on trying to piece together the timeline of things on a visual level and also on a textual level. And fortunately, we don't have a lot of text to work with, so it makes relying on the visual level a bit more appealing, perhaps. Ava thinks FromSoft are meticulous crafters, especially Miyazaki, who is a wild man when it comes to referencing other religions and ideas. They didn't tell each other anything, and their descriptions for the processes could be intentionally cryptic. So, yeah, so with the architecture and stuff, like, it does feel very obvious that the old dynasty is one of the most ancient things in the Lands Between. But like I was mentioning earlier with like the big super dark gray pillars that we find on the outskirts of all of the cliffs in the continent, well, not like all of the cliffs, but like the southern portion of Limgrave, the eastern portion of Caelid next to Radahn's arena, the mountaintops kind of by the kiln of the, not First Flame, of the kiln of the giants, whatever you want to call it. So is that stuff supposed to be more ancient than the old dynasty? I kind of get that vibe. The Ruin-strewn Precipice is another good example of it, but it's unclear. It seems counterintuitive that it would be younger than the old dynasty, but it also seems like it could be plausible if it's more giant related. But if so, it's kind of curious that we don't have more information about it, or like the golem makers, things like that. So the golems simultaneously feel older than Marika's reign, but also like they've been incorporated into it. And maybe there's a story to be told in the stonework that is on the golems themselves that could be more of a visual thing. I don't know. All right, so let's go back to the video.
From other people. But they use the Kabbalah and a lot of other spiritual and kind of like early mysticism to code their like early chemistry findings. So, for example, if you want to, let something sit in water to dissolve its like chemical properties for 7 days, you might, depict a green lion that has like 7 red stars, and then on the 7th day, your chemical mixture will turn red, and like that's how you know that like you need to add the next step, or that you're like at the point in the process in which you're able to do more chemistry shit, whatever. But obviously there's a lot of imagery that depicts the sun and the moon and a conjoined child that just looks a little funky, a little misbegotten, maybe a little Mikola. Maybe Mikola is Mercury, maybe. I have feelings about that, which I talked about in my metals video. I talked about how Mikola is Mercury. Anyway, going back, some cool things in the Kabbalah is that there is sacred geometry that talks about a shape called the Flower of Life, and it is created by layering several circles over and over and over, and if you layer them correctly, you can actually create the Tree of Life out of the flower of life, and blah 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 blah. This is the tree of life right here.
And I was going to say, you can pretty much see this exact design on what I showed earlier with the Chloranthy symbol. So right here, like the big Chloranthy design, the chrysanthemum is flanked by those kinds of 6-petaled flower looking like things, which is almost exactly what you get here. But obviously, like, we have more petals on the outside as opposed to like the more circular stuff, but I digress.
Flower of life is 6 circles that are placed in like a really careful arrangement. So this is the flower, this is the tree. Something really cool, though, once again, revisiting the Miranda powder. It is the flower that has the tree of life inside of it. And I think that's why we have those images or that like language calling Miranda the crucible of the flowers, and then we have the crucible of the Erd tree. And how they're related to each other.
Yeah, and if I'm remembering correctly in cut content, the Miranda priestess was the priestess of the crucible or something along those lines. For what it's worth, Melina can use the Miranda's prayer style cut attack, which is just like the Miranda flower, like beams of light coming from the sky. So maybe there was supposed to be more of a connection there in earlier content.
You'll have to see it. It's really cool. It's cool mysticism. I don't know what it means. There's Celestial Dew. Check it out. Check out Zeastorm video. Check out history. I'm gonna make this board public so y'all can add to it. I think that's all I wanted to say. I think my big takeaway from Miyazaki's whole shit, his whole thing, is that ancient humans notice patterns in the natural world. We depict them through art, through spirituality, through early sciences. When we create language, it allows us to create law, communicate ideals, discuss human rights. Through fire, commerce, spirituality, war, and art, humans are able to trade this knowledge and grow. Our language starts to overlap, our myths start to overlap, the symbolisms start to overlap. Early chemists come under scrutiny by the church, by each other. And there is this mankind's pursuit of knowledge and human ascension that has its own issues, ownership, ethics, who has the right to the Philosopher's Stone. You know, I think that we even have these questions in modern day times in regard to the internet and social media. Who deserves to have this power? What are they going to use it for? How many advertisements do we have to sit through every day? How much targeted social media is making our brains fucking anxious?
So I feel like we've gotten to the part of how this Elden Ring history has broken her.
Just and depressed as hell. There's a lot. There's a Pandora's box of technology that we're constantly opening on ourselves, and it doesn't stop, and by the time that it's already open, we ask ourselves these questions. So I love this wild ride that we're all on. It's great. Anyway, this video is going to be a 40-minute long one. Have a good night, everybody. It's 11 p.m., so thankfully it's not that late. I didn't record that long. So I'm going to take a long break from recording videos, maybe 2 weeks, because I really want to focus on my commissions. I want to stream Cult of the Lamb more. Follow me on Twitch, follow me on Twitter. I'm going to be active on social media. I'm going to be active on Twitch. I just need a break from recording and writing scripts and organizing information because I feel like Selene becoming like an orb. And I was having fun in my orb era. I was really vibing and having a good time, but now I'm feeling a little burnt out. I need to go back to being a human for a little bit. Alright, everybody. Good night, goodbye, thank you.
Yeah, that's
the Souls games are well.
Oh man, that's so loud. Alright, yeah, so that's very understandable when you're working on producing a lot of content like this. I think this was a very good video. It has a lot of really interesting information. Obviously, I'm a little bit disappointed she didn't try to connect these different eras more directly into the periods that we know of in Elden Ring. I think that might have also helped her structure her thoughts, although I obviously don't know what she was originally intending to go out and do. And so I don't want to say like because she failed to come up with like a conclusive statement, that means like we shouldn't take like a lot of the art history type stuff super seriously. I'm not trying to say that at all, but I do think it's important to treat these more as like references rather than like one-to-one signs of exactly how things in the real world are depicted in the Elden Ring world, the lands between. But with that being said, I do feel like a lot of these parallels are very solid, like the whole Ur dynasties or the Mogwin dynasty Colosseum being based off of the Parthenon in Greece. And so there is a lot of value for making these parallels, but then we come into the value prospect question of how is that significant for me? And of course, that's always going to be a bit of a more personal answer. And so I feel like even if we don't have like one major answer for everything, smaller bits of information can help make informed guesses about self-contained bits of information, if that makes sense. I know that's kind of like vague and or obvious and or redundant there, but I'm trying to think of a good example of something like that where you don't want to like draw too big of a net, but the smaller stuff might help you. So, okay, if you draw too big of a net, you run into the issues of like the random stuff like the Crucible, Ordovis, and Silurian periods not like really having a ton of relevance to anything else and not fitting in. So they just seem more like, hey, a cool reference to like primordial style life perhaps, but it doesn't really fit in much beyond that. So it's kind of hard to differentiate what is significant from what is not without a lot of individual discretion, I guess. So yeah, your mileage may vary in interpreting the symbolism of Elden Ring, which we've said many times, maybe not quite that succinctly before. So I'm going to go ahead and link her video into chat if you guys enjoyed it, whether or not that means her connections, which you should, because like a lot of these are super cool, which I didn't know about, or even if you just enjoyed the schadenfreude of her misery in going through this, or even if you commiserated and understand exactly where she's coming from, go ahead and send her a like. So that'll pretty much be it for tonight's stream. We will be going live again tomorrow. Maybe we'll watch the rest of the Ember videos that we had on the docket, because we spent a lot of time just kind of like talking about some of the fun stuff and the worst stuff of all these games, and that was a blast. So I'll figure out what else we can watch with that later on, and we'll go from there. We'll be live again at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. You guys all stay safe till then, and even after then, and take care. That'll be it for me. Last Protagonist out.